The city is quiet, the lights are low. You've closed the door on the day's noise, and now we dive into the silence. Welcome to Midnight Narrative. This content is a narrative based on public records and is intended as a non graphic, peaceful bedtime story. Tonight, the case file is open on the Black Dahlia, before she was a headline, before she was a ghost haunting the boulevards of Los Angeles, before her name became synonymous with unsolved mysteries and urban legends whispered in the dark, she was just a girl. A girl with a lovely, easy smile who loved the movies and dreamed of seeing her name in lights. A girl who wrote long letters to her mother in careful, looping handwriting, who giggled with roommates over shared cigarettes in crowded apartments, who turned heads when she walked down the street, not because she was extraordinary, but because she carried herself as if she might be. Her name was Elizabeth Short, not the Black Dahlia, not yet, not the legend, not the mystery, not the cautionary tale that would be told and retold for generations, just Elizabeth. She was 22 years old when she died. 22 years of life, of hopes and heartbreaks, of small disappointments and smaller triumphs. 22 years of being a real person with all the complexity and contradiction and beautiful mundanity that entails. But that person, that real, breathing, dreaming girl, would be almost completely erased by what happened to her in January of 1947. Buried under headlines and speculation, under myth and legend, and the city's insatiable appetite for tragedy, until the truth of who she was became nearly impossible to find. But we're going to try. We're going to begin not with her death, but with her life, because Elizabeth Short deserves that much, doesn't she? She deserves to be seen as more than a mystery, more than a victim, more than a name attached to the most infamous unsolved murder in Los Angeles history. She deserves to be remembered as a girl who once smiled for a camera with a white gardenia tucked behind her ear, who believed, really believed, with the kind of faith that only the young possess, that something wonderful was waiting for her just around the corner. Let me tell you about that girl. But first, because we cannot escape it, because it is the terrible gravity around which this entire story orbits, I need to tell you about the morning she was found. January 15th, 1947, dawned cold in Los Angeles. Cold, at least, by California standards. The temperature had dropped to about 58 degrees overnight, and in the early morning hours, a marine layer hung low over the city, that thick coastal fog that turns everything gray and indistinct, that muffles sound and softens the hard edges of the urban landscape. It was the kind of morning where you could see your breath, where the dampness seemed to seep into your bones, where Los Angeles briefly forgot it was supposed to be paradise and admitted to being just another city, subject to the same cold realities as anywhere else. Betty Bersinger was up early that morning. She was 27 years old, a housewife and mother living in the Limert Park neighborhood, which in those days was a pleasant middle class area of Los Angeles, the kind of place where people took pride in their homes and knew their neighbors' names and felt safe letting their children play on the sidewalks. Her baby daughter had been fussy that morning, restless and whining in that inconsolable way that infants have when nothing, not feeding, not changing, not rocking, seems to help. Betty, exhausted but experienced, knew that sometimes the only solution was fresh air and movement. So she bundled her daughter into the carriage, wrapped herself in a coat against the morning chill, and stepped out into the quiet gray dawn for a walk. Norton Avenue was nearly deserted at that hour. It was just after 10 o'clock in the morning, but the street felt emptier than the time would suggest, wrapped in that peculiar stillness that fog brings. The houses were modest but well maintained, their lawns neatly trimmed, their facades painted in the soft pastels that Southern California seemed to favor. Between two of those houses, on the east side of the street, was a vacant lot, just an empty patch of weedy ground, perhaps 100 feet deep, the kind of forgotten urban space that exists in every city, waiting to be built on, waiting to become something, but for now, just nothing. Betty was walking past that lot, the carriage wheels clicking rhythmically on the sidewalk, when something caught her eye. There was something in the weeds, something pale, something that didn't belong. She slowed, squinting through the morning grayness. Her first thought was that it was trash. Los Angeles, for all its sunshine and glamour, produced trash like any other city, and vacant lots were often dumping grounds for things people wanted to be rid of: old furniture, broken appliances, garbage that didn't fit in the bins. But this didn't look like trash exactly. She couldn't quite process what it looked like. As she stopped the carriage and stared, trying to make sense of what her eyes were showing her, her brain offered up an explanation that seemed reasonable. It was a mannequin, a department store mannequin, broken and discarded. She could see what looked like a torso, pale and smooth, lying in the brown grass. The proportion seemed right for a display dummy. Some store had probably redecorated, thrown out their old mannequins, and someone had dumped them here rather than pay for proper disposal. It happened. The city was full of strange sights, strange trash. This was just another oddity in a city that specialized in oddities. Betty almost kept walking. Almost. But something made her look closer, something about the way it was positioned, something about the color of that pale surface, something her subconscious had noticed, even if her conscious mind hadn't yet caught up. She took a few steps closer to the edge of the lot, not entering it, but close enough to see more clearly. And that's when she realized it wasn't a mannequin. The body was lying on its back in the weeds, positioned about 15 feet from the sidewalk. Even from a distance, even through the morning fog, the arrangement was clearly deliberate. The arms were raised above the head, elbows bent. The legs were spread apart. The torso had been completely severed at the waist, the two sections placed a few inches apart from each other, as if to emphasize the division, to make absolutely certain that anyone who found it would understand. This was intentional. The skin was white, not the white of mannequin plastic, but the bloodless white of a corpse, a color that doesn't exist in nature among the living, a color that the human brain recognizes on some primal level as wrong, as death. Betty Bersinger didn't scream. She didn't faint. She simply stood there for a moment, her hand on the carriage handle, her mind trying and failing to fully process what she was seeing. And then, with the kind of practical clarity that sometimes comes in moments of crisis, she turned the carriage around and walked, quickly, purposefully, but didn't run. She had a baby to think about, to the nearest house. She knocked on the door. When a man answered, she said as calmly as she could manage, "Please call the police. There's a body in the lot, a woman. She's Please call the police right now." The man saw her face and didn't ask questions. He called. Within minutes, sirens began to converge on Norton Avenue, shattering the morning quiet. The officers who arrived first approached the scene with professional caution. They'd responded to plenty of dead body calls over the years. Los Angeles in the 1940s was a violent city, and the LAPD saw its share of homicides, gangland killings, domestic violence, drunken brawls gone too far, suicides, accidents. But this was something else entirely. As they got closer, as they saw what had actually been done to the young woman's body, even the most experienced officers felt their stomachs turn. This wasn't just a murder, this was something beyond the normal spectrum of human violence. The body had been severed in two with extraordinary precision. The cut was clean, professional, made between the second and third lumbar vertebrae in exactly the place where the spinal column could be divided with the least resistance. Whoever did this had anatomical knowledge. Medical training, perhaps, or at least access to medical texts, an understanding of how bodies were put together and how they could be taken apart. The corpse had been completely drained of blood. Not a drop remained in the tissues, and there was no blood at the scene. None. Not in the dirt, not on the grass, not anywhere. Which meant that this young woman had been killed somewhere else. Somewhere the killer had privacy and time and the facilities to do what he wanted to do without interruption. The body had been meticulously washed, scrubbed clean as if prepared for presentation. Even the hair had been shampooed, the dark waves still holding the shape of careful styling. And then there were the other injuries, lacerations to the face, cuts at the corners of the mouth, extending the smile into a grotesque Glasgow grin, mutilations to the body that I won't detail here, not because they're not important to the investigation, but because they're not important to understanding who Elizabeth Short was. They tell us about the killer, about his pathology, about his need to control and degrade and destroy. They tell us nothing about the woman he killed except that she suffered, and she deserved none of it. What matters most, from a criminal perspective, is the precision, the care, the time it would have taken to do all of this. This wasn't passion. This wasn't rage spiraling out of control. This wasn't even sadism in the heat of the moment. This was calm. This was planned. This was a signature, a statement, a piece of performance art written in flesh and suffering. The killer had transported the body to this vacant lot in a residential neighborhood, had carried it from his vehicle, and there must have been a vehicle. The body couldn't have been carried far without being seen, and had positioned it carefully, deliberately, just feet from the sidewalk, where morning walkers and playing children would inevitably find it. He wanted her found. He wanted her seen. He wanted the world to witness what he had done. This was theater. This was a challenge. This was a monster announcing himself to the city. But who was she? This pale, broken thing in the vacant lot, arranged like some nightmare sculpture? Who was she before she became this? The body had no identification, no purse, no wallet, no jewelry, nothing in the pockets of the clothing that had been removed before the body was dumped. The killer had stripped her of everything, including her name. For several hours that cold January morning, she was just Jane Doe, Norton Avenue, another nameless victim in a city that produced them with alarming regularity. But fingerprints tell stories that bodies cannot. We'll return to that, to the moment when Jane Doe became Elizabeth Short, when the nameless dead became a person with a history and a family, and people who would weep at the news of her death. But first, let me take you back. Let me show you who she was before that terrible morning. Let me tell you about Elizabeth. Elizabeth Ann Short was born on July 29th, 1924, in Hyde Park, a suburb of Boston. She entered the world in the roaring 20s, that brief, giddy moment between wars when America convinced itself that prosperity and jazz and bootleg gin could last forever. She was the third of five daughters born to Cleo and Phoebe May Short, and from the very beginning, her life was defined by scarcity and impermanence. The Short family was working class, respectable in that particularly American way, where respectability is measured by how well you hide your struggles. They weren't poor, exactly. Cleo had a job, the family had a house, but they weren't comfortable either. There was never quite enough money, never quite enough space. The five Short girls shared bedrooms, shared clothes, shared everything. But Phoebe May Short was determined that her daughters would have certain things: clean dresses for church, good manners, the appearance at least of stability and normalcy. Cleo Short was a miniature golf course designer and builder, which sounds almost whimsical now, like something out of a children's book. But in the late 1920s, miniature golf wasn't whimsical at all. It was a genuine business opportunity. America was in the grip of a miniature golf craze. Thousands of courses were being built across the country. elaborate affairs with windmills and castles and water features. Families spent their evenings putting balls through tiny obstacles, and entrepreneurs made fortunes building the courses that hosted them. For a brief shining moment, Cleo Short was one of those entrepreneurs. His business was doing well. The family moved from Hyde Park to Medford into a nicer house, a better neighborhood. Money wasn't quite so tight. The future looked stable, even bright, and then the bottom fell out of everything. The stock market crashed in October of 1929. The Great Depression descended on America like a long, dark winter, and luxuries like miniature golf courses were among the first things to disappear. Why would a family spend money putting a ball around a fake windmill when they could barely afford to eat? The miniature golf craze evaporated almost overnight. Thousands of courses were abandoned, left to decay, the windmills still, and the water features dry. Cleo Short's business collapsed with them. By 1930, he was deeply in debt, unable to find work, watching his family slowly sink into poverty while he could do nothing to stop it. The weight of his failure, the unbearable pressure of being unable to provide for a wife and five daughters in the depths of the Depression, broke something in him. In the spring of 1930, Cleo Short's car was found abandoned on a bridge near Boston. There was no note, no body, but the implication was clear: suicide. He'd jumped. The waters had taken him. He was gone. The family held a memorial service. Phoebe May Short put on her black dress and brought her five daughters to church, and they mourned the husband and father they'd lost. Elizabeth was only 5 years old. She wouldn't remember much about her father, just fragments, a voice, a presence, the sense of someone who was there and then wasn't. She grew up believing he was dead, that the depression had killed him as surely as it had killed so many others, that he'd loved them but couldn't bear the weight anymore. It would be years before she learned the truth. Cleo Short hadn't killed himself. He had staged his suicide and walked away. He had abandoned his wife and five daughters in the middle of the Great Depression and simply started over somewhere else, unburdened by the family he could no longer support or couldn't bear to face in his failure. It's a betrayal so profound that it's difficult to fully grasp, even at this distance. But for young Elizabeth, it became a foundational truth about the world. People leave, people disappear, nothing is permanent, no one can be fully trusted to stay. Phoebe May Short held the family together through sheer force of will. She worked as a bookkeeper, a job that required precision and patience and long hours hunched over ledgers, making sure other people's numbers added up while her own never quite did. She stretched every penny until it screamed. She kept her five girls clothed and fed and in school. By all accounts, she was a strong woman, formidable even. She had to be. The alternative was starvation. But strength and determination can't cure asthma. Elizabeth was a frail child. She'd always been thin, always delicate, but the asthma made her childhood a constant struggle. She would wake in the night gasping, her chest tight, her breathing shallow and panicked, her lips turning blue in the darkness, while her mother held her and whispered reassurances and prayed that this attack wouldn't be the one that killed her. Massachusetts winters were brutal on her lungs. The cold, damp air made every breath a battle. She missed weeks of school at a time, falling behind in her studies, isolated from other children, spending her days in bed while her sisters went out into the world. The doctors were unanimous in their recommendation. She needed a warmer, drier climate, Florida, California, somewhere the air wouldn't try to kill her. So Elizabeth became a girl of many homes. In the winter months, when her breathing was at its worst, she was sent away to relatives in Florida, to family friends in California, anywhere the air was warmer and easier on her struggling lungs. She would spend months at a time living with people who were kind but weren't her mother, sleeping in borrowed beds, always temporary, always a guest, never quite belonging. What does that do to a child's sense of self? To never be quite settled anywhere, to always be arriving or leaving, never home for long enough to put down roots? It makes you adaptable. It makes you charming. It makes you learn, very young, how to make people like you quickly because you never know how long you'll be staying. It also makes you lonely. Friends from Elizabeth's teenage years, the classmates who knew her during the brief periods when she was back in Medford, remembered her as vivacious and friendly, but also somewhat exhausting. She needed to be the center of attention. She told elaborate stories, probably exaggerated, possibly invented, about the places she'd been and the people she'd met during her time away. She was dramatic, theatrical, always performing. But she was also genuinely likable. She had an easy laugh. She was kind to younger children. She helped her mother around the house without being asked. She wrote beautiful letters to the friends she'd left behind in Florida or California, keeping up correspondences across the miles, maintaining connections because connections were all she had that felt permanent. And she loved, with an almost religious fervor, the movies. It's difficult now, in our age of streaming services and endless content available at the touch of a screen, to understand what movies meant to young women in the 1930s and early 40s. This was before television had entered most homes, before the internet, before any of the thousand ways we now have to escape our lives and enter other worlds. The movie theater was the only portal to another reality. For a few hours in that darkness, you could stop being whoever you were, Elizabeth Short, poor girl from a broken family, sickly child bouncing between borrowed homes, and you could become someone else. You could lose yourself in the stories unfolding on screen, could watch goddesses move through impossibly beautiful worlds, could believe that transformation was possible, that beauty and fame and love and happiness were real things that happened to real people. Elizabeth went to the movies as often as she possibly could. She spent money she didn't have on tickets. She saw the same films multiple times. She wasn't just watching, she was studying. She studied the way Veronica Lake's hair fell across her face, that famous peekaboo style that drove men wild. She studied the way Jean Tierney held herself, that particular combination of elegance and accessibility. She studied Rita Hayworth's smile, Bette Davis's intensity, Joan Crawford's strength. She copied them. She practiced in mirrors. She learned to do her hair and makeup in the style of the stars. She learned to pose for cameras, how to tilt her head to show her best angle, how to smile in a way that seemed both inviting and mysterious. She was preparing. For what exactly, she probably couldn't have articulated, but she was preparing for some future version of herself, some life where she was more than what she was, where she mattered, where people knew her name. And then, in the summer of 1942, something unexpected happened, something that would change the trajectory of her life and ultimately lead her to that vacant lot on Norton Avenue. A letter arrived from California, from a dead man. Cleo Short was alive. Imagine receiving that letter. Imagine being Phoebe May Short, who had mourned her husband, who had raised five daughters alone for 12 years, who had struggled and sacrificed and survived, only to discover that the man she'd grieved had simply been living another life on the other side of the country. The rage must have been extraordinary. But for Elizabeth, now 18 years old and increasingly restless in Medford, the news of her father's survival wasn't primarily about betrayal or reunion. It was about opportunity. Cleo Short was living in Vallejo, California, north of San Francisco, working in the shipyards that had exploded with wartime production after Pearl Harbor. The war had brought prosperity back to America, at least for those who could work. Cleo was making decent money. He had a place to live, and he'd reached out to the family he'd abandoned, wanting to reconnect, or at least to assuage whatever guilt had been gnawing at him for over a decade. He invited his daughters to visit, to stay with him if they wanted. For Elizabeth, the invitation wasn't really about her father. It was about California. California, the promised land, the land of sunshine and orange groves, and most importantly, the land of movie studios, Hollywood, the place where dreams came true, where girls from nowhere became stars, where beauty and talent and a little bit of luck could transform your entire life. Elizabeth had been preparing for this. All those hours in front of mirrors, all those movies studied frame by frame, all that practice. She was ready. In December of 1942, Elizabeth Short boarded a train in Boston and headed west. She was 18 years old. She carried a single suitcase containing everything she owned, and she carried a dream that felt, in that moment, absolutely certain to come true. The reunion with her father lasted 6 months. 6 months of slowly discovering that Cleo Short was not the father of her imagination, not the tragic figure who'd been driven to despair by circumstances beyond his control. He was a cold man, critical, emotionally distant. He had rules for his household, expectations. He drank. He was stern and difficult and offered no apologies for what he'd done to the family he'd abandoned. Elizabeth wanted freedom, wanted to go to Los Angeles, to Hollywood, to chase her dream while she was young and beautiful and still believed in it. Cleo said no, said she was too young, too naive, that Los Angeles would eat her alive, said she needed to stay in Vallejo, get a real job, be practical. They fought, and by the summer of 1943, Elizabeth had moved out. She was 19 years old, alone in California, with virtually no money, no job prospects, and no plan beyond a vague but powerful conviction that she was destined for something more than what she'd been born into. She did what many young women did during the war years. She followed the soldiers. There were military bases all over California, swollen with young men training for deployment to the Pacific Theater. And around those bases, like pilot fish around sharks, were the young women who worked in the towns nearby, who came to the USO dances and socials, who dated servicemen and wrote them letters and kissed them goodbye when they shipped out. Elizabeth got a job at the post exchange at Camp Cook, an army base near Lompoc. She worked during the day selling cigarettes and magazines to soldiers. In the evenings, she went to dances. She was good at dances, good at smiling and laughing and making young men feel special in what might be their last weeks on American soil. She was affectionate, attentive, flattering. She would kiss goodnight, would hold hands, would pose for photographs that the soldiers could carry with them overseas, always with a flower in her hair, always with that carefully practiced smile. But she wouldn't sleep with them. This became a pattern that would define her relationships with men for the rest of her short life. She would be flirtatious, romantic, seemingly available, but always stopping just short of actual consummation. She would let men think they were getting somewhere, would write them intimate letters, would talk about the future, but the relationship never became physical in the way the men expected and wanted. Some historians and researchers have suggested that Elizabeth had a medical condition, a congenital abnormality, or the result of sexual trauma that made intercourse painful or impossible. Others believe it was simply strategic, a way to keep men interested without giving away the one thing that, in the 1940s, was considered a woman's ultimate value. If she gave that away, what leverage did she have? What reason did they have to stay, to write, to remember her? Whatever the reason, it frustrated the men she dated, but it also made her memorable. She wasn't just another girl at the dance. She was Elizabeth Short, beautiful and charming and tantalizingly just out of reach. She dated many soldiers, posed for hundreds of photographs, collected their promises and their letters and their photographs in return. Some of them loved her or thought they did. Some of them resented her. Most of them simply moved on when they realized she wasn't going to give them what they wanted. And Elizabeth kept moving too. In the fall of 1944, she was arrested for underage drinking at a bar in Santa Barbara. She was 19. The legal drinking age was 21. It should have been a minor infraction, a fine maybe, But the juvenile authorities took a harder line. They contacted her mother in Massachusetts. They put Elizabeth on a train back east, sending her home like a wayward child. She hated every minute of it, hated being back in cold, gray Medford, hated living under her mother's roof again, subject to her mother's rules and expectations, hated watching her life become small and constrained and ordinary. She'd tasted California sunshine. She'd seen the palm trees and the boulevards. She'd been to Hollywood, even if just as a tourist. She'd touched the dream and she couldn't let it go. She lasted about a year in Massachusetts. Then, in the summer of 1945, as the war was ending and the world was transforming yet again, Elizabeth Short bought another train ticket west. This time she didn't go to Vallejo, didn't try to reconcile with her father. She went straight to Los Angeles, straight to Hollywood, straight into the heart of the dream, and straight, though she couldn't have known it, toward Norton Avenue and the vacant lot where her story would end. Los Angeles in 1945 was a city in the midst of profound transformation. The war had just ended. The defense plants that had operated 24 hours a day for 4 years were shutting down. Hundreds of thousands of workers were suddenly unemployed. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of servicemen were coming home, flooding back into civilian life with discharge papers and uncertain futures. The city that had swollen to bursting during the war years was now overcrowded, overstimulated, and dangerous. On the surface, it still glittered. The movie studios were roaring back to production after wartime restrictions. The billboards still promised sunshine and success. The palm trees still swayed in the warm breeze. The dream was still being sold on every street corner. But underneath, Los Angeles was something else entirely. It was a city of profound inequality, where mansion lined boulevards ran parallel to desperate slums. It was a city where police corruption was endemic, where organized crime had deep roots, where violence simmered just beneath the glamorous surface. It was a city of 10,000 young women, just like Elizabeth Short, all chasing the same dream, all believing they were special enough, beautiful enough, talented enough to be the one who made it. For every success story, and there were success stories, genuine Cinderella tales of drugstore clerks discovered and transformed into stars, there were thousands of stories of failure, of girls who waited tables for years and never got a call back, of women who went to audition after audition and never landed anything but extra work, of dreams slowly dying in cramped apartments and cheap hotels while the city promised and delivered nothing. Elizabeth Short joined that army of hopefuls with nothing but determination and a suitcase. She never had a place of her own in Los Angeles, not once. She moved constantly, sometimes every few days, staying with friends from the USO circuit, with men she was dating, in women's residential hotels, when she could scrape together the rent. She worked sporadically. Waitressing was the most common job, the default employment for pretty girls with no skills and big dreams. But she never held a position for long. She was fired for being late, for being unreliable, for spending her shifts flirting instead of working. Money was always a problem. She was always broke, always borrowing, always one step away from having nowhere to sleep. She ordered meals at restaurants and left without paying. She borrowed clothes from roommates and never returned them. She told elaborate lies about why she couldn't pay her rent, about money that was coming, about family emergencies. She wasn't malicious. She was surviving, doing what she had to do to keep going, to stay in the city, to stay close to the dream. When she had a little money, she stayed at places like the Hawthorne Hotel on Vine Street, one of many women's residential hotels in Hollywood. These were respectable establishments with strict rules: no men above the lobby, no drinking, curfews, communal bathrooms. The women who lived there were primarily young hopefuls like Elizabeth. aspiring actresses, would be models, secretaries, and shop girls who lived in tiny rooms and shared bathrooms and dreamed of something better. The women who knew Elizabeth at the Hawthorne had mixed memories of her. Some found her sweet and friendly, always willing to help with hair and makeup, generous with advice about where to go for auditions or which casting directors were worth pursuing. Others found her exhausting, a compulsive liar who claimed to have done bit parts in movies that no one could ever confirm, who said she'd dated famous actors, who talked endlessly about her big break that was always just about to happen. She told people she'd been married to a pilot who died in the war. There's no evidence this was true. She may have been genuinely attached to one or more of the servicemen she dated, and one of them may have been killed in action. That happened to thousands of young women during those years. But there's no marriage certificate, no record of a husband. It was likely another fiction, another story she told to make herself more interesting, more tragic, more memorable. She told people she'd done modeling work, that she'd appeared in films. Maybe she had, in the most technical sense, background work, the kind of extra roles that required no skill and paid almost nothing, where you stood in the back of a shot and pretended to have a conversation while the real actors performed in the foreground. But there's no evidence she ever had a speaking role, ever had her name in credits, ever got the break she was waiting for. She spent time in Long Beach at the beach, soaking up the sun that was good for her asthma, posing for photographs with servicemen who were stationed at the nearby naval base. There was a drugstore there on Ocean Avenue where she was a regular. She'd sit at the counter for hours, nursing a single Coke, chatting with the staff, reading movie magazines, just being somewhere that felt welcoming and safe. The people at the drugstore remembered her black hair, her pale skin, her carefully applied makeup, remembered that she almost always wore flowers, gardenias or dahlias, tucked behind her ear or pinned to her clothing. She said they made her feel pretty, made her feel special. Some people believe this is where the nickname originated, not the Black Dahlia that would come later from the newspapers, but just the Dahlia, the flower girl, the dark haired young woman who decorated herself with blooms. She dated constantly during this period. A parade of men, primarily servicemen or recently discharged veterans, but also civilians. Men with cars, men who could take her to nice restaurants, to nightclubs, to places where she might be seen by someone important. Men who knew people, who could make introductions, who might be the connection that changed everything. She was always looking for the door that would open, the opportunity that would transform her life. She went to every audition she could find, pursued every lead, every rumor of casting calls. She had a portfolio of photographs, carefully curated images that showed her at her best, that made her look like the stars she studied. But nothing ever came of it. By late 1946, Elizabeth Short had been in Los Angeles for over a year. She was 22 years old. She was no closer to her dream than when she'd arrived. She was chronically homeless, chronically broke, wearing the same few outfits over and over again, depending on the kindness of acquaintances who were growing tired of her neediness, her stories, her endless optimism that was starting to seem less charming and more delusional. People who knew her in those final months said she seemed tired. She still put on the performance in public, still did her hair and makeup carefully, still smiled and laughed and told her stories. But in private moments, when she let her guard down, there was a sadness there, a growing awareness, perhaps, that the dream wasn't going to happen, that she was just another girl in a city full of girls, all waiting for a phone call that would never come. In December of 1946, Elizabeth went to San Diego. She'd been invited to stay with a woman named Dorothy French, a middle aged widow whose son had met Elizabeth briefly and thought his mother might enjoy the company. Dorothy French would later describe Elizabeth as polite, well mannered, perhaps a bit lost. She stayed for several weeks, helping around the house, going for long walks, seeming to rest after the constant hustle of Los Angeles. While in San Diego, Elizabeth met a man named Robert Manley. His friends called him Red because of his light hair. He was 25 years old, married with a young child, working as a traveling salesman. By his own account, he was having troubles with his wife, feeling stressed and unappreciated. And when he met Elizabeth, beautiful, attentive, interested in everything he had to say, he was charmed. They went out a few times to restaurants, to bars, for drives along the coast. Red would later insist repeatedly and desperately that nothing physical happened between them. They talked, they enjoyed each other's company. That was all. Whether that was true or not, Elizabeth made an impression on him. She told him about her dreams, about Hollywood, about the career she was going to have. She was convincing. Red believed her, believed that she was on the verge of something big. After Christmas, Elizabeth told Dorothy French that she needed to return to Los Angeles. Her sister was coming to visit, she said. She needed to meet her. This was a lie. Her sister wasn't coming. No one knows why Elizabeth felt the need to leave San Diego, why she decided to go back to Los Angeles after what seemed to be a peaceful few weeks away from the struggle. Maybe she was restless. Maybe she'd overstayed her welcome. Maybe she really did believe that one more trip to Hollywood would be the one that changed everything. Red Manley, helpful or smitten or both, offered to drive her. On January 9th, 1947, they left San Diego and headed north toward Los Angeles. It was about a 2 hour drive up Highway 101. They stopped along the way for drinks at a bar. Elizabeth seemed nervous, agitated. She chain smoked. She was quiet one moment, chattering the next. Red asked if she was okay. She said she was fine, said she was excited to see her sister. They arrived in downtown Los Angeles in the early evening, around 6:30. Elizabeth had asked Red to drop her off at the Biltmore Hotel, one of the grandest hotels in the city, an ornate Spanish Gothic structure on Pershing Square that had hosted movie stars and presidents and the Academy Awards. "Why the Biltmore?" Red asked. "That's where she was meeting her sister," Elizabeth said. Red pulled up to the hotel entrance. Elizabeth gathered her small suitcase, thanked him for the ride, and stepped out of the car. She was wearing a black suit with white trim and a sheer white blouse underneath. Her dark hair was carefully styled. She looked beautiful, put together, like someone who belonged walking into the Biltmore. Red watched her go into the lobby, watched her walk toward the bank of telephones near the entrance, presumably to call her sister and let her know she'd arrived. And then Red Manley drove away. That was the last confirmed sighting of Elizabeth Short alive. For the next 6 days, her whereabouts are a complete mystery. No one knows where she went, who she was with, where she slept, what she did. Those 6 days are a black hole in the middle of the story, a gap that has never been filled despite decades of investigation and speculation. 6 days. Somewhere in Los Angeles, during those 6 days, Elizabeth Short encountered someone. Someone who saw her not as a person with dreams and hopes and a complicated history, not as a girl trying to survive in a city that was hostile to dreamers, not as someone's daughter or friend or potential sweetheart. Someone who saw her as an object, as an opportunity, as raw material for something monstrous. And somewhere in those 6 days, in a location that has never been found, Elizabeth Short was murdered. The investigation moved quickly once the body was discovered. The Los Angeles Police Department knew immediately that this was going to be a major case. The brutality was extraordinary. The theatrical staging suggested a killer who wanted attention, who wanted credit, who might strike again if not caught quickly. And the press, God, the press were already circling like sharks, their photographers trying to get past the police line, their reporters shouting questions. The LAPD needed to identify the victim, needed to give her a name so they could start building a timeline, interviewing associates, finding out who she was and who might have wanted to do this to her. The body was fingerprinted at the scene. The prints were clear. Death hadn't been long enough ago for decomposition to obscure them. The prints were sent by telegram to the FBI headquarters in Washington, where they maintained a national database of fingerprints from criminal arrests, military service, and government employment. Normally, searching through that database took time days, sometimes weeks to manually compare prints and find a match. But this wasn't normal. The LAPD pushed. The FBI understood the urgency. Agents worked through the night of January 15th and into the 16th, searching their files for a match. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon on January 16th, 1947, less than 30 hours after Betty Bersinger made her terrible discovery, a telegram began clattering through to LAPD headquarters. The prints belonged to Elizabeth Short, age 22, last known address in Medford, Massachusetts, but with a history of residence in California. Fingerprinted in 1944 following a juvenile arrest for underage drinking in Santa Barbara. The FBI had her on file. Now the police had a name. Now they could notify the family. Now they could begin the real investigation. And now the press could have their story. Within hours of the identification, reporters were fanning out across Los Angeles, tracking down anyone who'd known Elizabeth Short. They interviewed her roommates at the various hotels where she'd stayed. They talked to the men she'd dated, the landlords she'd stiffed, the restaurant owners whose bills she'd skipped out on. They contacted the drugstore in Long Beach. They found photographs, dozens of them, hundreds eventually. Elizabeth posing with servicemen, Elizabeth smiling for the camera with flowers in her hair. The newspapers went into a feeding frenzy. The Los Angeles Examiner, the Los Angeles Times, the Herald Express, they competed viciously for exclusives, for details, for any angle that would sell more papers than their rivals. And somewhere in those frantic first days, someone, a reporter or an editor, no one knows exactly who, came up with the name that would echo through history. Elizabeth Short had sometimes been called the Dahlia because of the flowers she wore. And there was a movie that had come out the previous year, a successful murder mystery starring Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake called The Blue Dahlia. Someone put it together: black hair, black suit, the Dahlia. The Black Dahlia. It was perfect from a headline perspective, alliterative, mysterious, tinged with film noir glamour. It evoked darkness and beauty and tragedy in just 3 syllables. The name appeared in the papers, and once it did, there was no going back. Elizabeth Short, the real person, the girl from Medford who loved movies and dreamed of stardom, was erased. In her place was the Black Dahlia, a character, a symbol, a legend. She'd wanted to see her name in lights. She'd wanted to be famous. She'd wanted to be remembered. And in the cruelest possible irony, she got her wish. But the name that was remembered wasn't hers. The story that was told wasn't really about her. The legend that grew and grew over the decades buried the truth of who she'd been under layers of speculation and myth. The moment she had a name, she lost her identity. Elizabeth was gone. The Black Dahlia was about to be born. And in the years to come, as the investigation failed to find her killer, as the case became the most infamous unsolved murder in Los Angeles history, as books and movies and television shows told and retold her story, the real Elizabeth Short, the girl who smiled for cameras with a gardenia in her hair, who wrote long letters home, who believed against all evidence that something wonderful was waiting just around the corner, would be lost to us. Almost, but not quite. Because every time we tell her story, every time we look past the headlines and the mythology and the grotesque details of her death to see the life she lived before that terrible morning, we bring her back a little. We remember Elizabeth. Not the Dahlia, not the legend, not the mystery, the girl. And perhaps that's the most important thing we can do, the kindest thing, the thing she deserves: to be seen, to be remembered, not as a victim or a symbol or a ghost haunting the city that destroyed her, but as a person who lived, who hoped, who dreamed, who mattered. A city is more than just a collection of buildings and streets. It is a living organism with a pulse, a memory, and a soul. And in 1947, the soul of Los Angeles was deeply, profoundly troubled. It was a city of impossible light and unfathomable darkness, a place where dreams were manufactured on an industrial scale, but nightmares were the grim, unspoken reality for so many. Los Angeles was a city of angels, yes, but it was also a city of demons. And in the days following the discovery of Elizabeth Short's body, those demons would rise from the shadows and take center stage, turning a murder investigation into a public spectacle of chaos, corruption, and naked ambition. This is the story of that city, the story of the two powerful, flawed institutions that would come to define the case, the police and the press, and the story of how their toxic dance of competition and codependency would forever shape the legend of the Black Dahlia, bearing the truth under an avalanche of sensation and lies. To understand why this case was never solved, you must first understand the city that failed to solve it, a city at war with itself. The Los Angeles Police Department of 1947 was not the professional, technologically advanced organization we know today. It was something else entirely. It was a blunt instrument, a force forged in the crucible of the Great Depression and the boom years of the war, and it operated with a swaggering, brutal confidence that often blurred the line between law enforcement and organized crime. The badge in 1947 Los Angeles was less a symbol of public trust and more a license to operate in the city's gray spaces. The department was notoriously corrupt, from the patrolmen on the beat taking payoffs from bookies and brothel owners, to the highest levels of command, where alliances were forged with powerful mob figures like Mickey Cohen and Bugsy Siegel, and where the interests of the Hollywood studios were often prioritized over the pursuit of actual justice. This was the era of the Hat Squad, a team of elite detectives who were famous for their fedoras, their expensive suits, and their off the books methods. They were the enforcers, the troubleshooters, the men who were called in when a problem needed to be solved quietly and with maximum prejudice. They didn't bother with warrants. They didn't worry about civil liberties. They conducted their interrogations with their fists and their saps, believing that a confession beaten out of a suspect was just as good as one given freely and much quicker to obtain. This was the culture of the LAPD, a culture of violence, secrecy, and a deep seated cynicism about the people they were sworn to protect. They saw the city not as a community to be served, but as a jungle to be tamed, and they saw themselves as the only predators tough enough to do the taming. Into this brutal, compromised world fell the body of Elizabeth Short. The case landed on the desk of Captain Jack Donahoe, the head of the Homicide Division. Donahoe was a career cop, a large, gruff man with a face like a road map of back alley brawls and smoke filled rooms. He was a product of the system, a man who understood how the city really worked, who knew which lines could be crossed and which ones couldn't. He was a capable investigator, but he was also a political animal, keenly aware of the immense pressure that was about to descend on his department. A murder like this, so bizarre, so public, so clearly the work of a monster who could be anywhere, be anyone, was a direct challenge to the LAPD's authority. It was a high profile failure waiting to happen. The mayor was on the phone, the chief was on the phone. The newspapers were already sharpening their knives. Donahoe knew that his career and the reputation of his entire department hung on solving this case and solving it quickly. He assigned his two best men to lead the investigation, Detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown. Hansen and Brown were a study in contrasts. Harry Hansen was the veteran, the old school detective, methodical and relentless. He was a man who trusted his gut, who believed that you could learn more from walking a beat and talking to informants than you could from any scientific theory. He was respected and feared in equal measure, a man who had put more killers behind bars than anyone else in the division. Finis Brown was younger, more modern, a representative of the new breed of detective who were beginning to embrace a more scientific approach to police work. He was interested in forensics, in evidence collection, in the careful, painstaking work of building a case that would stand up in court. Together, they were a formidable team, but they were about to be swallowed by a storm that no amount of experience or professionalism could have prepared them for. Because in 1947 Los Angeles, the police were not the only ones who investigated murders. There was another power in the city, an institution just as aggressive, just as ruthless, and in many ways even more influential than the LAPD. The press. The newsrooms of post war Los Angeles were not quiet places of thoughtful journalism. They were factories of sensation, loud, chaotic cauldrons where stories were forged in the heat of competition and the adrenaline of the deadline. The air was thick with cigarette smoke. Typewriters clattered like machine guns. Phones rang incessantly, and men in shirt sleeves and loosened ties shouted at each other across crowded desks, all of them chasing the same thing: the headline, the scoop, the story that would sell more papers than the other guys. And in 1947, there were two newspaper titans locked in a brutal city spanning war for dominance: William Randolph Hearst's Los Angeles Examiner and the Chandler family's Los Angeles Times. The Examiner was Hearst's baby, and it reflected his personality. It was loud, aggressive, sensationalist, and utterly shameless in its pursuit of a story. Hearst had famously declared, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war," and his newspapers operated on that principle. Facts were secondary to narrative. Nuance was an enemy to be destroyed. The goal was not to inform, but to inflame, to entertain, to shock. Examiner. Reporters were paid bonuses for exclusives, and they were encouraged to do whatever it took to get them. The Los Angeles Times, on the other hand, saw itself as the more respectable paper, the voice of the city's business and political establishment. It was more conservative, more reserved, but it was just as competitive. The Chandlers hated Hearst, and the idea of being beaten by the Examiner on a major local story was anathema to them. So while the Times maintained a veneer of journalistic ethics, its reporters were under just as much pressure to get the story, and they were often willing to bend the rules to do it. When the story of the unidentified body in Leimert Park broke, both papers immediately understood what they had: a potential sensation, a beautiful young woman, a horrific murder, a citywide mystery. This wasn't a crime brief to be buried on page 12. This was front page news, the kind of story that could sell papers for weeks, even months. And so the war began. Reporters descended on the crime scene on Norton Avenue before the police had even finished securing it. They trampled through the vacant lot, potentially destroying footprints or other trace evidence. Their photographers, with their enormous, cumbersome speed graphic cameras, jostled for position, their flashbulbs popping and sizzling, trying to get the most graphic, the most shocking shot of the body. They bribed patrolmen for details. They listened in on police radio frequencies. They were not observers of the investigation, they were active and often destructive participants in it. Their methods were breathtakingly unethical, even by the standards of the time. But nothing illustrates the rapacious nature of the press more clearly than what they did to Elizabeth Short's mother, Phoebe. Once the police identified the body as Elizabeth Short, they knew they had to notify her family in Medford, Massachusetts. But before the LAPD could make that official, terrible call, reporters from the Los Angeles Examiner got Phoebe Short's phone number. They called her, but they didn't tell her that her daughter was dead. Instead, the reporter on the line told Phoebe that her daughter, Elizabeth, had just won a beauty contest in Los Angeles. Imagine Phoebe's reaction: a lifetime of worry about her frail, restless daughter, a constant fear that her dreams would lead her to ruin. And now this, a phone call from a reporter in Los Angeles telling her that Elizabeth had won, that she was a success, that her dreams were coming true. Phoebe was overjoyed, relieved. She wept with happiness, and the reporter kept her on the line, asking questions. What was Elizabeth like as a child? What were her hopes, her dreams? Did she have any photographs? The reporter coaxed every detail, every personal anecdote, every mother's memory out of Phoebe, all under this false, cruel pretense. The examiner didn't just want the story, they wanted an exclusive. They offered to fly Phoebe and her other daughters out to Los Angeles, to pay for their hotel, to help with the arrangements for what Phoebe believed would be a celebration of her daughter's success. All they asked in return was that she speak only to them, not to any other reporters. Phoebe, grateful and overwhelmed, agreed. It was only after they had secured her cooperation, only after they had milked her for every quote and memory, that they finally told her the truth. Your daughter didn't win a beauty contest, Mrs. Short. Your daughter is dead. She's been murdered. It is an act of such calculated cruelty that it is difficult to comprehend. But for the examiner, it was just business. It was how you got the scoop. It was how you won the war. And it was just the beginning. The press was not content to simply report on the investigation. They wanted to shape it. They wanted to create the story, not just cover it. And to do that, they needed a name, a brand. Elizabeth Short was a name, but it wasn't a headline. It was too plain, too ordinary. It didn't sing, it didn't sell. They needed something better, something dark and mysterious and memorable. They needed the Black Dahlia. The nickname didn't come from nowhere. It had roots, tangled and complex, in Elizabeth's own life and in the cultural landscape of the time. One of those roots was in Long Beach. During her time in Southern California, Elizabeth had often frequented a drugstore on Ocean Avenue in Long Beach. It was a place she felt comfortable, a place where she could sit at the soda fountain for hours, nursing a single Coke, reading the movie magazines, chatting with the staff and other customers. It was a small island of stability in her otherwise transient life. She was memorable there, with her striking dark hair, her pale skin, and her habit of always wearing black. She stood out. And there was her signature affectation, the flowers. She almost always had a flower, a gardenia, a camellia, or often a dahlia, pinned to her black suit or tucked into her dark hair. She said they made her feel pretty, made her feel like a star, even when she had less than $1 in her pocket. The staff at the drugstore and some of the other regulars had a nickname for her. They called her the Dahlia, the flower girl, the dark haired young woman who decorated herself with blooms. It was an affectionate, personal nickname rooted in a real place and a real memory of her. But that was only half of the equation. The other half came from Hollywood itself. In 1946, just a few months before Elizabeth's murder, Paramount Pictures had released a successful film noir called The Blue Dahlia. The film starred Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake, two of the biggest stars of the era, and it was written by the great crime novelist Raymond Chandler. The plot of Varp or The Blue Dahlia or Its Edge resonated deeply with the anxieties of post war America. Alan Ladd played a returning naval officer who comes home to find that his wife has been unfaithful and is mixed up with a shady nightclub owner. When his wife is murdered, he becomes the prime suspect and must go on the run to clear his name, plunging into the dark, corrupt underbelly of Los Angeles. The film was a hit, and its title was in the public consciousness. It evoked a world of suspicion, dark secrets, and beautiful women who were not what they seemed. So, in the smoke filled, deadline driven newsroom of the Examiner or the Herald Express, a reporter or an editor, someone who had heard the drugstore nickname, made the connection. The Dahlia from Long Beach, the Blue Dahlia from the movies. But Elizabeth wasn't a blonde like Veronica Lake. Her signature color was black. Her hair was black. The suit she was last seen in was black. The mystery surrounding her was dark and impenetrable. Black. The Black Dahlia. It was perfect, alliterative, evocative. It transformed Elizabeth Short from a person into a pulp fiction character. It made her the femme fatale in her own murder mystery. It created a narrative that was instantly recognizable and endlessly compelling. The name first appeared in the papers a few days after the murder, and once it did, it spread like wildfire. Within a week, no one was calling her Elizabeth Short anymore. She was the Black Dahlia. And with that name, something profound and terrible happened. The real woman, the lonely girl from Medford, the asthmatic child, the dreamer who loved movies and wrote letters to her mother, began to disappear. She was replaced by a fictional character, a creature of shadow and mystery, a woman who, the headline subtly implied, had courted danger and perhaps gotten what she deserved. The press had their brand, and now the police had to solve the murder of a legend. The first 72 hours of any murder investigation are the most critical. This is the golden window, the time when the trail is warmest, when memories are freshest, when the chances of finding the killer are at their highest. For Detectives Hanson and Brown, those first 72 hours were a vortex of chaos and frustration. Their first priority was to find what they called scene number one, the place where Elizabeth Short was actually killed. The vacant lot on Norton Avenue was just a dumping ground. The real crime scene, the place where she was held, tortured, and murdered, was still out there somewhere. And that place would be rich with evidence. It would hold the killer's secrets. Hanson and Brown and dozens of other officers fanned out across the city, chasing down every lead, no matter how flimsy. They checked every hotel room, every boarding house, every cheap apartment where a crime like this might have been committed. They searched abandoned buildings, back alleys, the basements of businesses. They interviewed landlords and hotel clerks, asking if they'd heard screams, smelled anything strange, seen anyone carrying large, heavy bundles. They found nothing. The city was a maze of dead ends. The killer, it seemed, had vanished without a trace and had taken his secret lair with him. The police found Manley at his home with his wife and child just a day after the body was identified. He was terrified. He had read the newspapers. He knew that the beautiful, mysterious woman he'd driven from San Diego was the victim of the most horrific murder the city had ever seen, and he knew that he was the last person known to have been with her. He was brought in for questioning. For hours, under the hot lights of an interrogation room, Hanson and Brown grilled him. They took him over his story again and again, looking for inconsistencies, for lies, for the one slip up that would reveal him as the killer. Manley's story was simple, and he stuck to it. He had met Elizabeth in San Diego. He was charmed by her. They'd gone out a few times. He had driven her to Los Angeles on January 9th. He had dropped her at the Biltmore Hotel at approximately 6:30 in the evening. He had watched her walk into the lobby, and then he had driven home to his family. He swore that was all. He swore he hadn't hurt her. He was just a married man who had made a foolish mistake, who had been briefly enchanted by a beautiful woman, and who was now caught in a nightmare. The police didn't believe him, not at first. He was the prime suspect, the only suspect. They gave him a lie detector test, a new and not entirely reliable technology at the time. He passed. They checked his alibi. They confirmed his whereabouts after he'd dropped Elizabeth at the Biltmore. His story held up. Reluctantly, they came to believe him. Red Manley was not the killer. He was just a witness, their only link to Elizabeth's final known movements. But his information created more questions than it answered. It left the police with a 6-day black hole. Elizabeth Short was dropped at the Biltmore on the evening of January 9th. Her body was found on the morning of January 15th. What happened during those 6 missing days? Where did she go after she walked out of the Biltmore lobby? Who did she meet? Where did she stay? These were the questions that haunted the investigation. The police retraced her steps. They spoke to the doorman at the Biltmore, the bellhops, the clerks. A few thought they remembered seeing a woman matching her description, but their accounts were vague, contradictory. She had made some phone calls from the lobby. She had been seen walking out onto Olive Street. And then nothing. She had vanished into the city, swallowed whole by the Los Angeles night. For 3 days, the police chased shadows. The pressure from the public and the press was becoming immense. The newspapers were screaming with headlines about the LAPD's incompetence, about the phantom killer who was mocking them. The city was gripped by fear and a kind of morbid excitement. The Black Dahlia was the only thing anyone was talking about. And Hanson and Brown had nothing. No crime scene, no murder weapon, no witnesses to the crime itself, and no suspects. The trail was not just going cold, it was freezing solid before their eyes. And then, on January 24th, 9 days after the body was found, the killer made his next move. The call came into the city desk of the Los Angeles Examiner. The caller was a man. His voice was calm, measured. He said he had something that belonged to the Black Dahlia. He said he was mailing it to the paper. Then he hung up. The lettering was not handwritten. It had been carefully, meticulously constructed from letters cut out of newspapers and magazines and pasted onto the envelope. Editors at the Examiner, smelling an exclusive, alerted the police, but also prepared to receive the package. They waited. The next day, a postal worker found a large manila envelope sitting on top of a public mailbox a few blocks from the Examiner building. It was addressed simply the Los Angeles Examiner and other Los Angeles papers. The lettering was not handwritten. It had been carefully, meticulously constructed from letters cut out of newspapers and magazines and pasted onto the envelope. Inside was a collection of Elizabeth Short's personal belongings: her birth certificate, her social security card, some photographs, including pictures of servicemen she had known, business cards, and an address book, its cover embossed with the name Mark Hansen. It was a treasure trove of evidence, a roadmap into Elizabeth Short's life, a list of dozens of men she had known, any one of whom could be a potential suspect or a witness. But there was a chilling detail. The police crime lab examined every item in the package: the birth certificate, the photos, the address book. Every single item had been wiped clean, doused in gasoline to dissolve any fingerprints. There was not a single usable print on anything. The killer had given them a wealth of information, but he had taken care to ensure that none of it could be traced back to him. And there was one more thing in the envelope: a note, like the address on the outside. It was made of pasted on letters from movie advertisements and newsprint. It was a simple 2-line message. Here is Dahlia's belongings. Letter to follow. The effect of this package on the city and on the investigation was electric. The killer was not in hiding. He was not afraid. He was communicating. He was toying with them. He had held on to these personal items, these pieces of Elizabeth's life, for days, perhaps weeks, and had now deliberately, contemptuously delivered them into the hands of his pursuers. It was a taunt. It was a challenge. The killer wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was stepping into the spotlight, ready to play a game with the entire city as his audience. And the police and the press and the terrified citizens of Los Angeles had no choice but to play along. The phantom had a voice, and he was promising more was to come. There is a particular kind of hell that exists in homicide investigations, a special torture reserved for detectives who can feel the truth slipping through their fingers even as they work themselves to exhaustion trying to grasp it. It's the hell of too many leads and not enough time, of promising threads that unravel into nothing, of witnesses who contradict each other, of evidence that points in every direction and therefore points nowhere at all. Detectives Harry Hansen and Finis Brown entered that hell in late January of 1947, and they would never entirely find their way out. The package sent to the Examiner, Elizabeth Short's personal belongings, meticulously cleaned of fingerprints and delivered with that taunting note, should have been the break they needed. It should have narrowed the investigation, focused their efforts, pointed them toward the killer. Instead, it did the opposite. It opened a Pandora's box of possibilities, a maze of names and faces and connections that branched and subdivided until the investigators found themselves lost in a wilderness of their own making, chasing shadows that multiplied faster than they could be eliminated. This is the story of how an investigation doesn't just fail. It's the story of how it collapses under its own weight, how it's sabotaged by the very publicity that was supposed to help it, how it's drowned in a flood of false leads and confessions, and the desperate need of a frightened city to believe that the monster had been caught. This is the story of the Phantom's game, and how, in the end, the Phantom won. The address book arrived at the examiner offices like a gift from a malicious god. It was small, perhaps 4 inches by 6 inches, with a black cover embossed with a name, Mark Hansen. Hansen was a nightclub and theater owner in Hollywood, a man who moved in the city's entertainment circles, who knew actors and starlets and hopefuls, who had a large house on Carlos Avenue where he sometimes allowed young women to stay when they were between apartments or down on their luck. Elizabeth Short had stayed there, briefly, intermittently. She had borrowed the address book from Hansen's home at some point, probably to copy down phone numbers, and had simply never returned it. It was one of many small things she'd borrowed and not returned during her time in Los Angeles: clothes, money, books, cosmetics. She lived on borrowed time in borrowed spaces with borrowed things, always meaning to return them, always moving on before she could. Now, that address book was the most important piece of evidence in the most high profile murder investigation in Los Angeles history. Inside its pages were approximately 75 names, men mostly, though there were a few women. Some entries were complete, full names, addresses, phone numbers. Others were just first names or nicknames with numbers that might be current or might be months out of date. Some pages had been torn out, removed by Elizabeth or by the killer, leaving only ragged edges and unanswerable questions. The LAPD immediately understood the magnitude of the task ahead of them. 75 names meant 75 potential witnesses, 75 possible suspects, 75 rabbit holes to explore. And each name would likely lead to more names, to associates and friends and acquaintances, to an ever expanding web of people who might have known Elizabeth Short, who might have information, who might be the killer they were searching for. Captain Donahoe assigned a team of detectives to the address book. Their orders were simple: find every single person in that book, interview them, establish their whereabouts during the critical period between January 9th and January 15th, and determine if any of them had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit this crime. It was a monumental undertaking, and it began with such hope, such certainty that somewhere in those 75 names was the answer they needed. But as the days turned into weeks, as the interviews accumulated and the reports piled up on Hansen's desk, a grim reality began to emerge. They were chasing ghosts. The servicemen in the address book were the hardest to track down. Many had been discharged after the war and had scattered across the country, returning to hometowns in the Midwest or the South or New England. The police had to contact local departments in dozens of cities, had to wait for those departments to locate the men, to conduct interviews, to send back reports. The process was slow, agonizingly slow, and by the time they confirmed that a particular sailor or soldier had been in Ohio or Texas or Florida when Elizabeth was killed, weeks had passed and the trail had grown colder. Some of the names in the book belonged to men who had died in the war. Their entries were heartbreaking: phone numbers that rang and rang with no answer, addresses where landlords said the young man had shipped out in 1943 and never came back. Elizabeth had kept their names and numbers, had perhaps written to them, had perhaps hoped they would return and remember her. They never did. Other names belonged to men who barely remembered her. Sure, I met her once or twice at a USO dance. She seemed nice. I might have given her my number. I don't really remember. I had a girlfriend at the time. No, I never saw her again after I got discharged. No, I was in San Francisco when she was killed. My boss can confirm that. Interview after interview, the same pattern emerged. Yes, they'd met Elizabeth. Yes, she was pretty, friendly, a bit odd. No, they hadn't seen her in months. No, they had alibis. No, they couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt her. Dead end after dead end. Some of the names belong to the fringes of Hollywood: bit players, studio hands, men who worked as grips or drivers or casting assistants. These men inhabited the same world Elizabeth had aspired to, the same desperate ecosystem of auditions and rejections and big dreams deferred. The police interviewed them in their small apartments, in the dingy offices of casting agencies, in the back lots of studios. Yeah, I knew Betty. We all knew her. She was at every open call, every audition. She was sweet, but she wasn't going anywhere, you know? She didn't have the talent or the luck or whatever it is that separates the ones who make it from the ones who don't. Did I ever go out with her? Maybe once or twice. Drinks, dinner. She was nice to talk to. Did anything happen? Number. She was a tease. Everyone knew that. You'd get so far and then nothing. It was frustrating, sure, but you moved on. There were plenty of other girls. The interviews revealed a portrait of Elizabeth that was both sad and familiar. She was known, but she wasn't close to anyone. She was liked, but she wasn't loved. She was remembered, but only vaguely, as one of the many interchangeable hopefuls who haunted the margins of Hollywood, all of them chasing the same impossible dream. And crucially, none of the men they interviewed seemed capable of the crime that had been committed. The murder of Elizabeth Short required time, privacy, and a level of sadistic control that suggested deep pathology. Most of the men in the address book were just ordinary guys, former servicemen trying to readjust to civilian life, working stiffs trying to make a living, small time operators trying to get ahead. They were liars sometimes, adulterers occasionally, users of women frequently. But monsters? The kind of monster who would do what was done to Elizabeth Short? The detectives didn't think so. Still, they kept working. They tracked down every name, conducted every interview, checked every alibi, because what else could they do? The address book was their best lead, their only lead, really. So they followed it down every branching path, even as those paths led nowhere, even as the investigation began to feel less like detective work and more like a Sisyphean task, an endless labor that would never reach a conclusion. Mark Hansen himself, the man whose address book it had been, became a person of intense interest. He was interviewed repeatedly, his background was examined, his movements during the critical days were scrutinized. Hansen owned the Florentine Gardens nightclub, a popular Hollywood spot where servicemen and sailors went to drink and watch stage shows featuring scantily clad chorus girls. He also owned several properties, including the house on Carlos Avenue where Elizabeth had stayed intermittently. He was a wealthy man, well connected, with a reputation as something of a ladies' man who enjoyed the company of beautiful young women and who often helped them out when they needed a place to stay. His relationship with Elizabeth was complicated. He had allowed her to stay at his house, but he hadn't been particularly close to her. Some witnesses suggested that Hansen had been attracted to Elizabeth, that he had perhaps made advances that she had rebuffed, and that he had been angry about that. Others said Hansen was simply a kind man who helped young women out of genuine generosity, and that his feelings for Elizabeth were paternal, not romantic. The police investigated him thoroughly. They searched his properties. They interviewed his friends and employees. They checked his alibi for the critical period, and they found nothing that definitively connected him to the murder. Hansen had alibis. He had witnesses who placed him at his nightclub on the relevant nights. He submitted to questioning without a lawyer, cooperated fully, even seemed genuinely shaken by Elizabeth's death. In the end, the police could not rule him out entirely. He remained a person of interest, but they also could not build a case against him. He joined the growing list of men who were suspicious, but not quite suspicious enough, who were connected to Elizabeth, but not connected to her murder, who existed in that gray zone of possibility that the investigation could neither confirm nor eliminate. The address book, which had seemed like such a gift, had become a curse. It had given the police too much to do and not enough clarity. It had scattered their focus across 75 different directions when what they needed was singular purpose, a single thread to follow to the truth. But the address book was not the only curse afflicting the investigation. There was something else, something even more destructive and time consuming: the confessions. Human beings are strange, broken creatures, and nothing illustrates that better than the phenomenon of false confessions in high profile murder cases. Within days of the Black Dahlia story hitting the national news, police stations across Los Angeles began receiving phone calls and walk ins from people claiming to have killed Elizabeth Short. At first, the police took each confession seriously. They had to. Any one of them could be legitimate. Any one of these people calling or walking through the door could be the monster they were searching for. But as the confessions multiplied 10, 20, 30, eventually more than 50, it became clear that something else was happening. Something psychological, something disturbing in its own right. These people were not killers, they were something else entirely. Some were mentally ill, suffering from delusions or psychotic breaks that made them believe they had committed crimes they'd only read about in the newspapers. They would walk into a police station, trembling and weeping, and confess in vivid detail to murdering the Black Dahlia, describing acts they could not possibly have committed because they had been in another state or hospitalized or incarcerated at the time. When confronted with these facts, they would become confused, agitated, insisting that their memories were real even as the evidence proved otherwise. Others were lonely, desperate for attention, for recognition, for any kind of human contact, even if that contact came in the form of interrogation and imprisonment. They were sad, broken people who had been invisible their entire lives, and confessing to the most famous murder in America was a way to finally be seen, to finally matter, even if it meant being seen as a monster. Still others seemed to be engaging in a kind of morbid fantasy, a dark game where they could inhabit the role of the killer, could experience the thrill of being dangerous and powerful and feared. They would confess, then recant, confess again with different details. They seemed to be testing the boundaries of the narrative, seeing how far they could push the story before it broke. And a very few, seemed to be deliberately wasting police time, either for personal amusement or to protect someone else. These were the most frustrating because they were often convincing. They knew details from the newspapers. They could describe the crime scene. They could mimic the behavior of a genuine suspect. And it was only after hours or even days of investigation that the police would discover the confession was a hoax. Each confession had to be investigated, had to be taken seriously until it could be definitively disproven, and each investigation took time, manpower, resources that could have been spent on legitimate leads. One of the most compelling false confessions came from a 29-year-old Army corporal named Joseph Dumais. Dumais walked into a police station in San Francisco on January 23rd and confessed to killing Elizabeth Short. He was articulate, calm, and his story had a veneer of plausibility. He said he had met Elizabeth in San Francisco in December. They had started a romantic relationship. She had moved down to Los Angeles ahead of him, and he had followed a few days later. They had met at the Biltmore Hotel. They had fought about something. He was vague on the details, and the fight had escalated. He had killed her in a fit of rage. The San Francisco police contacted the LAPD. Dumas was transported to Los Angeles for questioning. Hansen and Brown interviewed him for hours. His story seemed to hold up under initial scrutiny. He knew details about Elizabeth. He knew about the Biltmore. He seemed genuinely remorseful. But as the questioning continued, cracks began to appear. The timeline didn't quite work. His description of Elizabeth's appearance was slightly off. And crucially, he could not explain how he had transported the body, where he had held her during the days between her disappearance and the discovery of the corpse, or how he had committed the very specific surgical mutilations. When pressed on these details, Dumais became confused. His story changed. He started contradicting himself. Finally, he broke down and admitted that he had never met Elizabeth Short. He had read about the case in the newspapers and had become obsessed with it. He had started to believe that he had killed her, that the memories were real, even though some part of him knew they weren't. He was released. The LAPD had wasted 3 days on a false confession, and Dumais was far from the only one. A 22-year-old bellhop confessed, claiming he had killed Elizabeth in a hotel room. His story fell apart when the hotel confirmed he had been working the night shift during the critical period and had never left the building. A 47-year-old drifter confessed, providing elaborate details about dismembering the body. But he had the location wrong, the method wrong, and when police checked his background, they discovered he had been in jail in Arizona when Elizabeth was killed. A woman in her 30s confessed, claiming she had killed Elizabeth in a jealous rage over a man they had both been dating. But the woman had never been to Los Angeles, had never met Elizabeth, and was suffering from a severe mental illness that caused her to confess to multiple crimes she hadn't committed. On and on it went, confession after confession, each one requiring investigation, each one ultimately leading nowhere. The phenomenon was so widespread that it began to generate its own headlines. The newspapers, which had initially reported each confession breathlessly as a potential break in the case, now began to mock the confession craze, writing sarcastic pieces about the 50 murderers of the Black Dahlia and the epidemic of false guilt. But for Hansen and Brown and the rest of the investigation team, it wasn't funny. It was a nightmare. Each false confession pulled detectives away from legitimate leads. Each one generated paperwork, reports, man hours that could have been spent elsewhere. Each one was another layer of noise, obscuring the signal they were desperately trying to hear. And the worst part was that they could never be entirely certain. What if one of these confessions was real? What if, buried in this avalanche of lies and delusions, was the actual killer trying to hide in plain sight, counting on the police being too overwhelmed to distinguish truth from fiction? They couldn't take that risk. So they investigated every confession, chased every ghost, even as the real trail grew colder and colder. But the confessions were not the only communication the investigation was receiving. The killer himself, or someone claiming to be the killer, had more to say. The letter arrived at the Examiner on January 26, 2 days after the package containing Elizabeth's belongings. Like the first communication, it was constructed from letters cut out of newspapers and magazines and pasted onto a sheet of paper. The handwriting, or rather the hand assembly, was meticulous, almost obsessively neat. Each letter was perfectly aligned. The spacing was precise. Whoever had created this had taken their time, had been careful, had enjoyed the process. The message was short, cryptic, and deeply unsettling. Had my fun at police, Black Dahlia Avenger. The signature, Black Dahlia Avenger, would be used in subsequent communications, and it would give the phantom correspondent a name, an identity, even if that identity was a mask. The letter was immediately turned over to the LAPD. Forensic examiners studied it under magnification, looking for any trace evidence, any fingerprints, any clue to the author's identity. They found nothing. Like the package before it, the letter had been meticulously cleaned. The paper was a common brand available at any drugstore. The paste was ordinary library paste. The cutout letters came from a variety of sources: movie advertisements, news headlines, classified ads, but nothing that could be traced to a specific newspaper or issue. The only thing the examiners could determine was the mindset of the person who had created it. This was not the work of someone in a frenzy, someone acting impulsively. This was careful, controlled. This was someone who enjoyed puzzles, who enjoyed taunting his pursuers, who was intelligent enough to avoid leaving evidence, but arrogant enough to reach out and make contact. Forensic psychologists, a relatively new field at the time, were consulted. They analyzed the phrasing, the choice of words, the structure of the communication. "Had my fun at police," suggested someone who felt superior to law enforcement, who viewed the investigation as a game, as entertainment. It was contemptuous, mocking. Black Dahlia Avenger was even more revealing. The killer was adopting the press's nickname for his victim. He was participating in the mythology that had been created around the crime. He was making himself part of the story, the dark protagonist in a pulp fiction narrative. But the word avenger was particularly interesting. An avenger is someone who rights a wrong, who punishes the guilty. It suggested that, in the killer's mind, Elizabeth Short had done something that required punishment. He saw himself not as a murderer, but as an agent of justice, someone who had corrected an imbalance, who had given her what she deserved. It was a chilling insight into the psychology of someone who could commit such an act and feel no remorse, only satisfaction. More letters followed in the weeks to come. Some were sent to the police, others to newspapers. They varied in length and content, but they shared common characteristics: the same cut and paste construction, the same meticulous care in assembly, the same taunting superior tone. One letter promised to turn himself in. The date came and went. No one appeared. Another letter contained a cryptic poem about death and beauty and the corruption of innocence. It read like bad film noir dialogue, melodramatic and overwrought, but it also revealed an ego, a need to be seen as sophisticated, as artistic in his brutality. The question that haunted the investigators was simple: were these letters real? Were they actually from the killer? Or were they from a hoaxer, someone piggybacking on the case for attention? The first package, the one containing Elizabeth's belongings, had to be from the killer. There was no other way to explain how the sender had obtained those items. But the subsequent letters, those could be from anyone. The details they contained were all things that had been published in the newspapers. There was nothing in them that only the killer could have known. The police were divided. Some believed all the letters were from the killer, that he was playing an elaborate game, enjoying his moment in the spotlight. Others believed the first package was from the killer, but the subsequent letters were from copycats, from disturbed individuals who wanted to insert themselves into the narrative. There was no way to be certain, and that uncertainty was part of the torture. Every letter had to be analyzed. Every clue, no matter how cryptic or absurd, had to be followed. Because what if it was real? What if buried in the melodrama and the taunting was a genuine slip, a real clue that could lead them to the killer? The Black Dahlia Avenger became a phantom, a shape shifting figure who existed somewhere between reality and fiction. Was he a single person or multiple people? Was he the killer, or was the real killer staying silent while others spoke in his name? The investigators didn't know, and not knowing was driving them to the edge of madness. But amid all the false confessions and cryptic letters, amid all the chaos and confusion, a few genuine suspects did emerge: men who had known Elizabeth, men whose behavior or background made them worthy of serious investigation, men who, for a time, seemed like they might be the answer. The first substantial suspect was a man named Robert Manley, Red Manley, the married salesman who had driven Elizabeth to the Biltmore. We've already discussed how Manley was initially the prime suspect, how he was interrogated and given a polygraph and eventually cleared, but the police never entirely let him go. There was something about his story that bothered them, something that didn't quite add up. He had admitted to being attracted to Elizabeth. He had admitted to going out with her while his wife was at home with their baby. He had driven her from San Diego to Los Angeles on the very day she disappeared. He was, by definition, the last known person to see her alive. And there were inconsistencies in his account. Small things, the exact time he'd dropped her off, what they'd talked about during the drive, where they'd stopped along the way. Manley was brought in for questioning again and again and again. Each time he told the same basic story, but each time there were small variations, the kind of variations that are either the sign of a lie being refined or the natural result of a stressed man being asked to recall the same events over and over. The pressure on Manley was immense. The newspapers had identified him as a person of interest. His name and photograph were printed. His neighbors knew. His employer knew. His wife knew. His life was falling apart under the weight of suspicion. In early February, Red Manley suffered a nervous breakdown. He was hospitalized, placed under psychiatric observation. The doctors reported that he was genuinely traumatized, tormented by guilt, not the guilt of murder, but the guilt of having been the last person to see Elizabeth alive, of having dropped her off in downtown Los Angeles, where someone else, someone monstrous, had found her. The police eventually concluded that Manley was not the killer. He was just a weak man who had made some bad decisions and had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But they kept his file open. Manley would remain a person of interest for years, a ghost that haunted the investigation, even though he was almost certainly innocent. Another suspect emerged from Elizabeth's time at the Carlos Avenue house, a man named Mark Hansen, the nightclub owner whose address book had been mailed to the Examiner. We've touched on Hansen already, but as the investigation progressed, the police looked at him more closely. Witnesses came forward saying that Hansen had been possessive of Elizabeth, that he had been jealous when she dated other men, that he had been angry when she moved out of his house. One witness claimed to have overheard an argument between Hansen and Elizabeth a few days before she disappeared. Hansen was supposedly yelling at her, accusing her of using him, of taking advantage of his generosity. Elizabeth had supposedly yelled back, saying she didn't owe him anything, that she was free to see whoever she wanted. Had that argument escalated, had Hansen's jealousy turned violent, the police searched Hansen's properties. They interviewed his employees at the Florentine Gardens. They dug into his background, looking for any history of violence or sexual deviancy. They found nothing definitive. Hansen was a businessman with a somewhat shady reputation. His nightclub operated in the gray area between legitimate entertainment and something more sordid. But he wasn't a violent criminal. He had no record of assaults, no history of abuse. His alibis were solid, confirmed by multiple witnesses. He had been at his nightclub on the nights in question, visible to dozens of people. Unless he had hired someone to commit the murder, and there was no evidence of that, it seemed impossible that he could have been the killer. Still, Hansen remained under suspicion. There was something about his relationship with Elizabeth, about the way he had allowed her into his home and then seemed to resent her presence, that didn't sit right with the investigators. But suspicion is not evidence, and without evidence, they couldn't move forward. A third suspect came from Elizabeth's time in San Diego, a man named Joseph Gordon Fickling. Fickling was an Army Air Force lieutenant, a pilot who had met Elizabeth in late 1946. They had struck up a correspondence. He had written her letters. She had written back. Some of those letters were in the package sent to the Examiner, and they suggested a romantic relationship. or at least the beginning of one. One of Elizabeth's letters to Fickling was particularly interesting. In it, she referred to herself as his wife, though there was no evidence they had ever married. She wrote about coming to visit him, about their future together, in language that was affectionate and hopeful. Fickling's letters to her were more reserved, more cautious. He seemed to be keeping her at arm's length, perhaps aware that she was more invested in the relationship than he was. The police tracked Fickling down. He was interviewed extensively. He admitted to knowing Elizabeth, to corresponding with her, but he insisted that their relationship had been casual, that he had never encouraged her fantasies about marriage, that he had been stationed on the East Coast when she was killed and had not seen her in months. His alibi checked out. He had been at his air base in North Carolina during the critical period. Dozens of witnesses could confirm his presence. Phone records showed he had made no calls to Los Angeles. There was simply no way he could have been involved. But like Manley and Hanson, Fickling remained in the files. His connection to Elizabeth, his presence in her life during her final months, made him a person of interest, even though he was almost certainly innocent. The pattern was becoming clear. The investigation was generating suspects, but none of them were quite right. They all had connections to Elizabeth. They all had possible motives: jealousy, rejection, anger, but none of them had the opportunity. None of them had the personality that would explain the level of sadism and control displayed in the murder. The police were looking for a monster, but all they were finding were ordinary men. Flawed men, certainly. Men who had used Elizabeth or lied to her or disappointed her, but not killers. And as the weeks turned into months, as the investigation sprawled out into hundreds of interviews and thousands of pages of reports, the terrible truth began to settle over the LAPD. They were failing. By March of 1947, the Black Dahlia case was no longer the lead story in the newspapers. It had been replaced by other scandals, other crimes, the normal churn of news in a city that never stopped producing headlines. But for the men working the case, it was still an open wound. The files on Elizabeth Short's murder filled multiple rooms at LAPD headquarters. There were boxes of evidence, stacks of witness statements, hundreds of photographs. The address book had generated a spider's web of connections that covered an entire wall in the detective bureau, a visual representation of just how complex and sprawling the investigation had become. And at the center of it all, pinned to the wall like a butterfly to a board, was the photograph of Elizabeth Short, smiling, beautiful, alive. Hanson and Brown were exhausted. They had worked 18-hour days for months. They had followed every lead, chased every rumor, investigated every tip. They had done everything right, everything by the book, and they had nothing to show for it. The press, which had initially supported the investigation, had turned on them. Editorial cartoons depicted the LAPD as bumbling fools, unable to catch a killer who was taunting them in the pages of their own newspapers. Columnists wrote scathing pieces about police incompetence, about corruption, about the failure of the city's institutions to protect its most vulnerable citizens. The public's fear had turned to frustration, then anger, then, worst of all, apathy. People were tired of hearing about the Black Dahlia, tired of the dead ends and the false confessions and the lack of progress. They wanted closure. They wanted an arrest. And when it became clear that neither was coming, they simply moved on. But the investigation couldn't move on, not officially. The case remained open. Hanson and Brown continued to work it, along with a handful of other detectives, but the urgency was gone. The resources were being redirected to other cases, newer cases, cases that might actually be solved. The trail wasn't just going cold, it was being buried alive under an avalanche of lies, rumors, and the city's own insatiable appetite for a story. The phone on Hanson's desk rang constantly. Tips still came in. A woman in Pasadena claimed her neighbor was acting suspiciously. A man in Long Beach said he'd seen someone carrying a large bundle on the night of January 14th. A psychic in San Francisco had a vision of the killer's face and wanted to describe it to a sketch artist. Each call was logged, each tip was investigated, at least cursorily. Most led nowhere. A few led to embarrassing dead ends. The suspicious neighbor was just a night shift worker coming home at odd hours. The large bundle was a rug being taken out for cleaning. The investigation had become a machine that consumed resources and produced nothing. It ground on not because anyone believed it would succeed, but because no one had the courage to officially declare it a failure. Detective Harry Hansen sat at his desk one evening in late March, the office mostly empty, the sun setting over Los Angeles and casting long shadows across the files and photographs that covered every surface. The phone rang. He let it ring 3 times before picking it up. Another tip, another witness who had just remembered something important, another lead that would almost certainly go nowhere. Hansen wrote down the information, his handwriting tired and mechanical. He thanked the caller, he hung up the phone, and he sat there in the gathering darkness, looking at the photograph of Elizabeth Short, wondering if they would ever know what had happened to her during those 6 missing days, wondering if her killer would ever face justice, wondering if this case would define and haunt the rest of his career. It would. The Black Dahlia case would remain open for decades. Hansen and Brown would retire without solving it. Other detectives would inherit the files, would re interview witnesses, would chase new theories and new suspects. The case would be reopened and investigated again in the 1970s, the 1990s, the 2000s, and it would never be solved. The Phantom had won his game. He had committed the perfect crime, not because he had left no evidence. He had left plenty, but because he had left too much. He had hidden his signal in an overwhelming noise of false leads and confessions and cryptic letters. He had let the media circus and the public hysteria do his work for him, obscuring the truth until it became impossible to see. Elizabeth Short's murder would become a legend, a ghost story, a piece of Los Angeles mythology. But the real tragedy wasn't the unsolved mystery. It was that in their obsession with catching the killer, the investigators and the press and the public had lost sight of the victim. Elizabeth Short had become the Black Dahlia, a character in a story, a puzzle to be solved. And the real woman, the girl from Medford who had loved the movies and dreamed of something better, was buried under the weight of that mythology, lost to us almost completely. The Phantom had not just won the game, he had erased her a second time. There is a particular kind of haunting that occurs when a crime goes unsolved. The absence of answers creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum rush theories, speculation, and suspects. Faces emerge from the shadows, each one a potential monster, each one carrying enough circumstantial weight to seem plausible, to seem possible, to seem like they could be the one. In the decades since Elizabeth Short's murder, dozens of men have been named as potential suspects, some by the police, some by journalists and amateur investigators, some by their own family members, carrying the terrible burden of suspicion towards someone they loved. Each suspect comes with a compelling narrative. Each has connections to Elizabeth or to the crime scene or to the particular pathology suggested by the murder itself. Each story, when told in isolation, seems to point inevitably toward guilt. But when you step back and look at them all together, when you see the full labyrinth of possibilities, the certainty dissolves. You realize that you're not looking at a solution. You're looking at a maze with 100 different paths and no clear way through. This is the curse of the Black Dahlia case. Not the absence of suspects, but the abundance of them. Not too few clues, but too many. all pointing in different directions, creating a fog of possibility so thick that the truth, whatever it is, has become impossible to see. Tonight, we're going to walk through that labyrinth. We're going to examine the most compelling suspects, the men who have been investigated most thoroughly, whose stories are most disturbing, whose guilt seems most possible. But I'm going to tell you now at the beginning that we will not emerge with an answer because there is no answer. There are only possibilities, only questions that multiply the more you ask them. This is the story of the men who might have killed Elizabeth Short, and the story of why, even after all these years, we still don't know which one of them, if any, actually did. Let me tell you about Dr. George Hill Hodel. If you were to design a suspect for the Black Dahlia murder from scratch, if you were writing a noir novel and needed a villain who embodied every dark possibility of 1940s Los Angeles, you would create someone very much like George Hodel. He was brilliant, charismatic, wealthy, a physician with extensive knowledge of anatomy and surgical technique. He moved in artistic circles, collected surrealist art, threw lavish parties at his distinctive Mayan Revival mansion in the Hollywood Hills, where artists and intellectuals and beautiful women gathered to drink and discuss ideas and push the boundaries of conventional morality. He was also, by multiple accounts, a monster. George Hodel was born in 1907, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants who had settled in Los Angeles. He was a child prodigy, intellectually gifted to an extraordinary degree. He entered the California Institute of Technology at age 15, studying music and mathematics. He was a concert pianist of genuine talent. He spoke multiple languages. He seemed destined for greatness. He chose medicine, and by his mid 20s, he had established himself as a successful physician with a practice in downtown Los Angeles. He married and divorced twice, fathering multiple children, displaying throughout his life a pattern of charm followed by cruelty, of intense attachment followed by casual abandonment. But his real passion was art, specifically surrealism. Hodel was deeply immersed in the surrealist movement of the 1930s and 40s. He collected works by Man Ray, Salvador Dali, and other surrealist masters. His home, the famous Soden House, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's son, Lloyd Wright, was itself a piece of surrealist architecture, all dramatic angles and hidden spaces, and an atmosphere of deliberate, unsettling strangeness. Surrealism, for those unfamiliar, was an art movement obsessed with the unconscious mind, with dreams and nightmares, with the violent juxtaposition of beauty and horror. Surrealist artists created images of bodies dismembered and recombined, of death made aesthetic, of suffering transformed into art. The connection to the Black Dahlia murder is not subtle. Elizabeth Short's body was not just killed, it was arranged, posed, displayed with a precision that suggested artistic intent. The bisection, in particular, struck many investigators as having a ritualistic or aesthetic quality, as if the killer was not just murdering, but creating, making a statement, producing an image. And George Hodel was a man who believed that the boundaries between art and life should be violated, that transgression was the highest form of self expression. But the case against Hodel goes far beyond his artistic inclinations. In 1949, just 2 years after the Black Dahlia murder, George Hodel was investigated by the LAPD for a different crime, the sexual abuse of his 14-year-old daughter, Tamar. Tamar accused her father of molesting her, of hosting parties where she was passed around to his friends, of committing acts of incest and abuse that were so disturbing that the case made headlines across the city. The trial was a sensation. Tamar testified in graphic detail. Other witnesses corroborated aspects of her story, and George Hodel was acquitted. His defense attorneys destroyed Tamar's credibility, painting her as a troubled, promiscuous teenager who was lying for attention. They suggested she had been influenced by malicious friends, that she had invented the accusations out of spite or mental illness. The jury believed them. Hodel walked free, but the LAPD didn't believe the verdict. They believed Tamar. And so, in early 1950, the police did something extraordinary. They bugged George Hoddle's house. For several weeks, hidden microphones in the Sowden house recorded conversations between Hoddle and his friends and associates. The police were looking for evidence of ongoing criminal activity, of sexual abuse, of anything that would allow them to arrest this man they knew was dangerous but couldn't quite catch. What they captured on those tapes was far more than they expected. In one conversation, George Hodel and an unidentified male companion discussed the Black Dahlia case. The recording is muffled, difficult to hear, but certain phrases are clear enough. The other man says something about the murder, about the police investigation, and George Hodel responds, his voice casual, almost amused. Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead. There's more. In other fragments of conversation, Hodel seems to reference getting away with it, to discuss the incompetence of the police, to make oblique references to things he's done that will never be discovered. The LAPD listened to these tapes. They transcribed them, they analyzed them, and they did nothing. Why? The reasons are murky, lost to time and departmental politics. Some researchers believe that Hodel had powerful friends, connections in the police department and the district attorney's office who protected him. Others believe that the evidence was considered too ambiguous, that the tapes could be interpreted multiple ways, that no prosecutor would take a case based on such fragmentary, circumstantial evidence. Whatever the reason, George Hodel was never charged with the murder of Elizabeth Short. He was never even officially questioned about it, as far as the public records show. In 1950, after the investigation into his abuse of Tamar, Hodel left Los Angeles. He moved to Hawaii, then to Asia, spending decades living abroad, practicing medicine in the Philippines and other countries, far from the reach of American law enforcement. He died in 1999 at the age of 91, having never confessed to any involvement in the Black Dahlia murder. And that might have been the end of the story, except for his son. Steve Hodel was a Los Angeles Police Department detective for more than 20 years. He was, by all accounts, a good cop, a thorough investigator, a man who believed in evidence and procedure and the patient work of building a case. He retired in the late 1990s, and shortly after his father's death in 1999, Steve began going through George Hodel's possessions, trying to make sense of the complicated, troubling man who had been his father. Among those possessions, Steve found photographs. One photograph in particular caught his attention. It was a portrait of a young woman, unidentified, taken in the style of Man Ray, the surrealist photographer who had been one of George Hoddle's close friends and artistic influences. The woman in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Elizabeth Short. Steve Hodel stared at that photograph, and a terrible suspicion began to form. He started to investigate his own father, using his skills as a detective, using the resources and connections he had built over 2 decades in law enforcement. Steve Hodel began to build a case. He obtained copies of the old LAPD surveillance tapes from 1950. He tracked down witnesses who had known his father in the 1940s. He researched George Hodel's movements, his known associates, his activities during the critical period in January of 1947. And the more he investigated, the more convinced he became that his father had killed Elizabeth Short. In 2003, Steve Hodel published a book, Black Dahlia Avenger. In it, he laid out his case in meticulous detail. George Hodel had medical training and surgical skill. He had the anatomical knowledge necessary to perform the bisection that was done to Elizabeth's body. He had connections to surrealist art and artists who aestheticized violence and death. who believed in transgressing boundaries, who might view a murder as a form of artistic expression. He had a documented history of sexual violence, of abuse, of seeing women, even his own daughter, as objects to be used and discarded. He had access to locations where the crime could have been committed. The Soden house, with its hidden rooms and soundproofed basement, would have been the perfect place to hold someone captive, to torture them, to dismember them without anyone hearing. And he had made statements, captured on police recordings, that seemed to be confessions, or at least admissions that he could have committed the crime and gotten away with it. Steve Hoddle's investigation was extraordinary in its thoroughness. He hired forensic document examiners to compare the handwriting on the Black Dahlia Avenger letters with samples of George Hoddle's handwriting. Some experts concluded they were a match. He hired cadaver dogs to search the grounds of the Souden house. The dogs alerted on multiple spots in the basement, indicating the possible presence of human remains or decomposition. He connected his father to other unsolved murders in Los Angeles during the same period, suggesting that George Hodel was not just a murderer, but a serial killer, responsible for multiple deaths that had been written off as unrelated crimes. The case that Steve Hoddle built is compelling, disturbingly so. When you read his book, when you see the evidence laid out in sequence, it's hard not to conclude that George Hodel was guilty, but there are problems. The photograph that started Steve's investigation has never been definitively proven to be Elizabeth Short. Some experts think it is, others are less certain. Thousands of photographs were taken of young women in Los Angeles in the 1940s, and many of them look similar. The handwriting analysis is not conclusive. Different experts have reached different conclusions. Handwriting comparison, especially of the cut and paste style used in the Avenger letters, is not an exact science. The cadaver dog alerts at the Souden house could indicate human remains, or they could be false positives. The house is nearly a century old. Multiple families have lived there. People have died there of natural causes. The dogs could be alerting on something completely unrelated to any crime. And the surveillance tapes, while suggestive, are not confessions. Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia could be the hypothetical statement of a man who knows he's being investigated and is testing the boundaries, seeing what he can say without incriminating himself. Or it could be dark humor, the kind of morbid joke a man like George Hoddle might make, especially if he knew the police suspected him and he was taunting them. Context is everything, and the context of those conversations is fragmentary at best. The case against George Hoddle is strong, but it's circumstantial, it's compelling, but it's not proof. And without proof, without physical evidence or a confession or an eyewitness, it remains a theory, a plausible, disturbing, well researched theory, but still just a theory. And George Hodel is not the only plausible suspect. Let me tell you about Leslie Dillon. Dillon was not famous, not wealthy, not a figure of any public importance. He was a bellhop, a man who worked in hotels, who carried luggage and accepted tips and remained invisible to the people he served. He was the kind of person who moved through Los Angeles without leaving much of a trace, except that he knew things, things about the Black Dahlia murder that he shouldn't have known. In January of 1949, 2 years after Elizabeth Short's murder, a psychiatrist named Dr. Paul DeRiver received a letter. DeRiver was a consultant to the LAPD, a specialist in sexual deviance and criminal psychology, a man who was often brought in on cases involving unusual or pathological behavior. The letter was from a man named Leslie Dillon, who said he was writing from Florida. Dillon claimed to be fascinated by the Black Dahlia case. He had read extensively about it. He had theories about the type of person who could commit such a crime. He wanted to discuss the case with Dr. DeRiver to explore the psychology of the killer. Dr. DeRiver, intrigued, wrote back. A correspondence began. Over the course of several letters, Dillon revealed details about the Black Dahlia murder that made DeRiver increasingly suspicious. Dillon knew things about the crime scene, about the condition of the body, about the specific nature of the mutilations that had never been released to the public. How did he know these things? Dillon's explanation was that he had a friend, a man named Jeff Connors, who had confessed to him that he had killed Elizabeth Short. According to Dillon, Connors was a dangerous man, possibly a doctor or someone with medical training, who had killed before and would kill again. Dillon was afraid of Connors, but he wanted to see justice done, so he was reaching out to the authorities. DeRiver contacted the LAPD. They were interested, very interested. But instead of conducting a normal investigation, instead of bringing Dillon in for official questioning, the LAPD authorized Dr. DeRiver to conduct an unofficial interrogation. DeRiver lured Dillon to Los Angeles under the pretense of helping with the investigation into this Jeff Connors character. And when Dillon arrived, DeRiver essentially held him prisoner, interrogating him for days in a hotel room, trying to extract a confession. It was a bizarre, possibly illegal operation. Dillon was not officially under arrest. He had no lawyer. He was being questioned by a psychiatrist, not a police officer, in circumstances that blurred the line between interview and kidnapping. During these sessions, Dillon revealed more details. He described the place where Elizabeth had been held and killed, a motel on South Crenshaw Boulevard. He described the method of murder, the disposal of the body, details that seemed to come from firsthand knowledge, but he always maintained that it was Jeff Connors who had done it, not him. He was just relaying what Connors had told him. The police investigated. They looked for Jeff Connors. They searched motels on South Crenshaw Boulevard, and they found evidence. At one motel, they found traces of what appeared to be blood in a bathroom that had been recently and thoroughly cleaned. They found evidence that a room had been rented during the critical period in January of 1947, rented to a man whose description loosely matched Dillon. It seemed like a break, a real break. After 2 years of dead ends, they finally had a suspect who knew details only the killer could know, and physical evidence that corroborated his story. But then, inexplicably, it all fell apart. Leslie Dillon was released. He was never charged. Dr. DeRiver was reprimanded for his unauthorized interrogation. The motel evidence was dismissed as inconclusive, and the entire episode was quietly buried by the LAPD. Why? The reasons have never been entirely clear. Some researchers believe that Dillon had an alibi that the police couldn't break, that he was out of state when Elizabeth was killed and could prove it. Others believe that the LAPD realized their handling of the interrogation had been so improper that any evidence they'd obtained would be inadmissible in court, and rather than admit to their mistakes, they simply let Dillon go. And there's another, more disturbing possibility. Some researchers have suggested that Jeff Connors, the mysterious friend Dillon kept blaming, was actually George Hodel, or someone connected to Hodel, that Dillon had some connection to the real killer, knew details because he had been present or had been told by someone who was but was too afraid or too implicated to tell the full truth. There's even a theory that Dillon and Hodel knew each other, that they moved in overlapping social circles, that the crime was not the work of a single individual, but of multiple people. A conspiracy of sorts. But these are speculations, theories built on fragmentary evidence and the gaps in the official record. What we know for certain is this: Leslie Dillon knew things he shouldn't have known. He led police to a location that appeared to be connected to the crime, and then he was released and disappeared from the investigation. Was he the killer? Was he an accomplice? Was he simply a disturbed individual who had become obsessed with the case and had somehow obtained inside information? We don't know. And the LAPD files on Leslie Dillon remain incomplete, suggestive, maddeningly inconclusive. He's another face in the labyrinth, another possibility, another dead end that might not be a dead end at all. But the labyrinth is deeper still. George Hodel and Leslie Dillon are the most thoroughly investigated suspects, the ones with the most evidence pointing toward them. But they are far from the only ones. Let me tell you about some of the others. Mark Hansen. We've mentioned him already. The nightclub owner, the man whose address book was mailed to the Examiner, the man who let Elizabeth stay at his house on Carlos Avenue. Hansen was successful, wealthy, connected. He owned the Florentine Gardens nightclub, one of the most popular entertainment venues in Hollywood during the war years. He had relationships with movie studios, with organized crime figures, with the powerful men who ran Los Angeles from the shadows. And he had an interest in beautiful young women. His home was something of a boarding house for aspiring actresses and models, young women who needed a place to stay while they chased their dreams in Hollywood. By most accounts, Hansen was generous with these women, asking for little or nothing in return, simply enjoying their company and the prestige of having beautiful girls around. But some accounts suggest a darker dynamic, that Hansen expected certain favors in return for his generosity, that he became possessive of the women who stayed with him, jealous when they dated other men or showed interest in leaving. Elizabeth Short had stayed at Hansen's house intermittently in late 1946. Witnesses reported that Hansen had been attracted to her, that he had made advances, that she had rebuffed him. Some said there had been arguments, that Hansen had accused Elizabeth of using him, taking advantage of his hospitality without giving anything in return. Hansen had the means. He was wealthy enough to have private spaces where a crime could be committed. He had connections that could help him dispose of evidence, people who owed him favors. He had motive, or at least a possible motive: rejection, humiliation, jealousy. But he also had alibis. Multiple witnesses placed him at his nightclub on the relevant nights. He cooperated fully with the police, submitted to questioning, allowed searches of his properties. And most investigators who dealt with Hansen came away believing he wasn't the type. He was a businessman, sometimes shady, sometimes ruthless, but not violent, not sadistic, not the kind of man who would torture and mutilate a woman, no matter how angry he was. Still, his name remains in the files, a person of interest, a possibility, another face in the labyrinth. And then there's Woody Guthrie. Yes, that Woody Guthrie, the famous folk singer, the voice of the American working class, the man who wrote This Land Is Your Land and countless other songs that became anthems of social justice and human dignity. How does Woody Guthrie become a suspect in the Black Dahlia murder? The answer is both strange and revealing of just how sprawling and chaotic the investigation had become. In the address book sent to the Examiner, there was a woman's name, a woman who had been friendly with Elizabeth Short. The police interviewed her as part of their systematic work through the book. During that interview, the woman mentioned that she had been receiving disturbing letters from Woody Guthrie. This was in early 1947, a period when Guthrie was struggling with the early symptoms of Huntington's disease, a degenerative neurological condition that affects behavior, impulse control, and judgment. He was drinking heavily, his behavior was erratic, his marriage was falling apart, and he had been writing letters, sexually explicit, sometimes violent letters, to various women he knew or had met casually. The woman in Elizabeth's address book showed these letters to the police. They were disturbing, graphic. They described sexual fantasies that were aggressive, sometimes violent. Did this make Woody Guthrie a suspect in the murder of Elizabeth Short? In a rational investigation, no, there was no evidence Guthrie had ever met Elizabeth. His letters, while disturbing, were directed at other women. His whereabouts during the critical period could be accounted for. He was in New York for much of January 1947, 3,000 miles from Los Angeles. But this was not a rational investigation anymore. This was an investigation that was drowning in possibilities, where every connection, no matter how tenuous, had to be explored. So Woody Guthrie's name went into the files. He was interviewed, probably by telephone or through New York police. He was quickly eliminated as a suspect. But the very fact that his name appears in the Black Dahlia files illustrates something important. The investigation had become so sprawling, so desperate, that even a tangential connection could make you a suspect. The net was cast so wide that it captured everyone and no one. Woody Guthrie was not the Black Dahlia killer. But in a city gripped by fear and obsession, in an investigation that had lost all sense of proportion, even an American icon could find himself pulled into the labyrinth. And finally, there's the theory that connects the Black Dahlia to a series of murders that occurred years earlier in another city entirely, the Cleveland Torso murders. Between 1935 and 1938, a serial killer operated in Cleveland, Ohio. The killer targeted marginal people, drifters, prostitutes, homeless men, and women, and killed them in a horrifyingly specific way. The bodies were decapitated, often dismembered, sometimes drained of blood, and they were dumped in public places, arranged for discovery. 12 victims were definitively attributed to the killer. There may have been more. The murders terrorized Cleveland. Elliot Ness himself, yes, the famous prohibition agent who had taken down Al Capone, was brought in to lead the investigation. He failed. The Cleveland torso murderer was never caught. The killing stopped in 1938 and the case went cold. But some investigators noticed similarities between those murders and the Black Dahlia killing: the dismemberment, the surgical precision, the draining of blood, the public display, the sense that the killer was making a statement, creating a tableau, turning murder into performance. Could the same person have committed both sets of crimes? It's possible. The timeline works. The Cleveland murder stopped in 1938. The Black Dahlia murder occurred in 1947, 9 years later. If the Cleveland killer had moved to Los Angeles, had perhaps been dormant for years, he could have resumed his work. Some researchers have even identified a specific suspect who was investigated in connection with the Cleveland murders and who later moved to Los Angeles, a doctor named Francis Sweeney. Sweeney was a physician, a veteran of World War I, a man who had the surgical skill necessary to perform the dismemberments seen in both Cleveland and Los Angeles. He was an alcoholic, his life and career in ruins by the late 1930s. He was Elliot Ness's prime suspect in the Cleveland murders, but there was never enough evidence to charge him. After the Cleveland killing stopped, Sweeney moved west. He was in California during the 1940s, living in various places, working sporadically, drinking constantly. Could he have killed Elizabeth Short? It's possible. The MO matches. He had the skill. He was in the area. But again, there's no direct evidence. Sweeney was never connected to Elizabeth Short. He was never placed at any of the locations relevant to her murder. He's a suspect purely on the basis of pattern, of methodology, of the chilling similarities between crimes committed in different cities at different times. Some researchers believe the theory is compelling. Others think it's a stretch, that the similarities between the murders are not specific enough to indicate the same killer, that this is pattern seeking, our brains trying to impose order on random violence. We don't know. We can't know. 1965, Francis Sweeney died, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. He's another face in the labyrinth, another possibility that can neither be proven nor eliminated. And so we find ourselves where the LAPD found themselves in the late 1940s, and where every subsequent investigator has found themselves in the decades since: lost, surrounded by possibilities, drowning in suspects. George Hodel, with his surgical skill and his surrealist aesthetics and his documented history of sexual violence, with his own son believing he was guilty. Leslie Dillon, with his inexplicable knowledge of details that were never made public, with his story of Jeff Connors, with the evidence found in that motel on South Crenshaw Boulevard. Mark Hansen, with his jealousy and his possessiveness and his connections to Elizabeth Short's final months. Francis Sweeney, with his connection to the eerily similar Cleveland murders, with his surgical background and his presence in California at the right time, and a dozen others we haven't even discussed. Suspects who were investigated and eliminated, suspects who confessed falsely, suspects who were plausible for a moment and then faded into the background. Each man was a plausible monster. Each story, when told in isolation, seemed like a perfect fit for the crime. But in a city of masks, a city where everyone was performing some version of themselves, where truth and fiction were constantly blurred, the real killer, if he was even among these suspects, wore them all. He was the brilliant doctor and the invisible bellhop. He was the jealous benefactor and the wandering madman. He was everyone and no one. Or perhaps he was someone else entirely, someone whose name never appeared in the investigation, someone who killed once in a moment of perfect, terrible opportunity and then disappeared back into the anonymous masses of Los Angeles, carrying his secret to the grave. Steve Hoddle believes his father was guilty. He has spent decades building his case, writing books, giving interviews, pursuing every lead. He believes, with the certainty of a trained detective and the pain of a betrayed son, that George Huddle killed Elizabeth Short and got away with it. He may be right, but the evidence that would prove it beyond doubt, the physical evidence, the confession, the smoking gun, doesn't exist. And after 75 years, it almost certainly never will. The same is true for every other suspect. They all exist in that maddening zone of possibility where the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, where the connections are there but the proof is not. This is the curse of the Black Dahlia case. Not the absence of suspects, but the presence of too many. Not too few clues, but too many possibilities. All of them leading down paths that branch and subdivide until you find yourself in a labyrinth with no center, no exit, only endless corridors of maybe and perhaps and could have been. And at the heart of that labyrinth, forgotten in the chaos of speculation and theory and the endless search for the killer, is the person this was all supposed to be about, Elizabeth Short. Not the Black Dahlia, not a puzzle or a mystery or a legend. A person, a young woman who died terribly, who deserved justice, who deserved to be remembered for who she was, not what was done to her. But in the 75 years since her death, she's been lost again and again, buried under theories and suspects and books and movies and the endless churning of the myth making machine. The investigation failed to find her killer. And in that failure, it also failed to preserve her memory, her dignity, her humanity. We've spent 3 episodes now walking through the facts of her life and death, through the chaos of the investigation, through the labyrinth of suspects. And what have we found? Questions, possibilities, faces in the shadows, but no answers, no justice, no resolution. Because in the end, the Black Dahlia case is not a story about a solution. It's a story about the absence of one. It's about how truth can be obscured beyond recovery, how a city's hunger for sensation can devour the very thing it claims to be seeking, how a human being can be transformed into a symbol and in that transformation erased. The killer, whoever he was, won his game. He committed his crime and disappeared, leaving behind only shadows and speculation. And Elizabeth Short, the girl with the gardenia in her hair, the girl who dreamed of seeing her name in lights, lost even her name. She became the Black Dahlia, and that is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. There are different ways to kill a person. The first is obvious, physical, the taking of a life through violence, the stopping of a heart, the ending of consciousness. This is murder in its most literal sense, and it is what happened to Elizabeth Short on an unknown day in January of 1947 in unknown location by an unknown hand. But there is another kind of killing, slower, more insidious, the murder of a reputation, the destruction of memory, the transformation of a human being into a fiction, a commodity, a thing to be bought and sold and consumed. This is what happened to Elizabeth Short in the days, weeks, months, and years after her body was found in that vacant lot on Norton Avenue. She was killed twice, once by the monster who tortured and mutilated her body, and again by the city that turned her into a legend, by the press that sold her story for profit, by the culture that transformed her from a person into a symbol, a cautionary tale, a piece of dark folklore to be endlessly recycled and repackaged for each new generation. This is the story of that second murder, the story of how Elizabeth Short was erased and replaced with the Black Dahlia, a fictional character who bore her face but none of her truth. The story of how grief and tragedy were transformed into entertainment, how a mother's pain became a headline, how a young woman's dreams and struggles and ordinary humanity were buried under an avalanche of lies, speculation, and the relentless machinery of myth making. This is the story of how they sold a ghost they created, a ghost that has haunted American culture for more than 75 years. And it begins, as so many terrible things do, with the newspapers. In the days immediately following the identification of Elizabeth Short's body, the Los Angeles newspapers went into a feeding frenzy that has rarely been matched in the history of American journalism. We've discussed this already, the competition between the Examiner and the Times, the race for exclusives, the contamination of crime scenes, the relentless pursuit of any detail, any quote, any photograph that could sell papers. But what we haven't fully examined is the specific, systematic way in which the press destroyed Elizabeth Short's reputation, how they took a murder victim, a young woman who deserved compassion and dignity, and turned her into a villain in her own story. It happened gradually at first, then with increasing viciousness. The early headlines were sympathetic. Beautiful young woman found slain. Actress murdered in brutal crime. There was shock, horror, a sense of tragedy. But that tone didn't last long because the newspapers quickly discovered something that would sell even more papers than sympathy: scandal. As reporters dug into Elizabeth's life, as they interviewed her former roommates and landlords and the men she had dated, they began to construct a narrative, not the narrative of a struggling young woman trying to survive in a hostile city, but the narrative of a femme fatale, a manipulative seductress, a woman who used her beauty to exploit men and who ultimately paid the price for her transgressions. The headlines shifted: the Black Dahlia, Beauty and the Beast. The implication being that she was somehow both, that her beauty concealed a beastly nature. Dahlia led double life, investigators reveal. The suggestion that she was duplicitous, secretive, hiding dark secrets. Love-starved, Dahlia sought thrills, painting her as sexually promiscuous, as a woman whose appetites led her to dangerous places and dangerous people. And most damningly, Dahlia's life was a series of romantic tragedies. She asked for it. She asked for it. Three words that encapsulate a particular strain of misogyny, a worldview that sees women who step outside narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior as deserving of whatever violence befalls them, a worldview that transforms victims into perpetrators of their own destruction. The newspapers interviewed men she had dated and printed their most bitter, resentful comments. Men who felt rejected by her, who were angry that she had been affectionate but not sexual, who saw her as a tease and were happy to say so on the record. She was all talk and no action, one man told a reporter. She'd let you think you were getting somewhere, and then she'd shut you down. It was a game to her. She liked to see men suffer. Another, she was a gold digger. always looking for a free meal, a free ride. She'd tell you sob stories about being broke, being hungry, and you'd help her out, and then you'd never hear from her again. She used people. These quotes were printed without context, without any counter narrative, without anyone speaking up to say that a young woman trying to survive without money or family support wasn't a gold digger. She was desperate. That a woman who flirted but maintained boundaries wasn't playing games, she was protecting herself. The papers dug into her past. They found the arrest for underage drinking in Santa Barbara when she was 19. They printed it as if it were evidence of moral degeneracy, not the minor infraction that it was. They interviewed neighbors from her various apartments and boarding houses and printed every petty complaint. She borrowed clothes and didn't return them. She was loud. She came home at odd hours. She had men calling for her. They tracked down people from Camp Cook, from her time following the servicemen, and framed that period of her life as evidence that she was loose, promiscuous, a victory girl, the wartime slang for women who slept with soldiers. Never mind that there was no evidence Elizabeth had actually been promiscuous, that by multiple accounts she didn't sleep with the men she dated. The narrative had been established. She was that kind of girl, and that kind of girl, the newspapers implied with varying degrees of subtlety, invited the violence that found her. The press created a character, the Black Dahlia, beautiful but corrupt, innocent looking but manipulative, a woman who used her sexuality as a weapon and who was ultimately destroyed by it. It was a story as old as time, the fallen woman, the whore who gets what's coming to her, wrapped in the language of 1940s journalism, but rooted in ancient prejudices about women, sex, and deserved punishment. And it was almost entirely fiction, because the real Elizabeth Short, the one described by people who actually cared about her, was nothing like the character the newspapers created. Letters from her to her mother, Phoebe, show a young woman who was affectionate, who worried about her family, who sent what little money she could manage back home, who wrote about her dreams not with arrogance, but with hope, with the touching optimism of someone who still believed good things could happen if she just kept trying. Friends from her childhood in Medford remembered her as sweet, generous, someone who looked after younger children in the neighborhood, who helped her mother around the house, who wrote thoughtful letters and remembered birthdays. Even some of the people she'd stayed with in Los Angeles, when interviewed more carefully, away from the feeding frenzy of the press, painted a different picture. Yes, she borrowed things. Yes, she could be exhausting with her constant talk of her big break, but she was also kind. She helped other girls with their hair and makeup. She listened to their problems. She was lonely and trying to connect, trying to build some kind of family in a city that offered her none. One roommate from the Hawthorne Hotel told investigators Betty was a dreamer, maybe too much of a dreamer, but she wasn't mean. She wasn't manipulative. She was just lost. She wanted so badly to be something more than what she was, and she didn't know how to make that happen. I felt sorry for her more than anything. But that quote didn't make the papers, or if it did, it was buried deep, overwhelmed by the more salacious material, because sympathy doesn't sell newspapers. Scandal does. Moral outrage does. The story of a bad girl getting her comeuppance does. Historians who have studied the coverage of the Black Dahlia case have noted how it reflects the deep anxieties about women in the immediate post war period. During World War II, women had entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They had taken jobs in factories, in offices, in roles that had previously been reserved for men. They had earned their own money, made their own decisions, lived independently. They had tasted freedom and power. And when the war ended, when the men came home, there was enormous social pressure for women to give all of that up, to go back to being wives and mothers, to retreat into domesticity, to let the men reclaim their traditional roles. Many women resisted. They wanted to keep working, keep their independence, keep the lives they had built, and the culture pushed back hard. The late 1940s were filled with messaging about the danger of the independent woman, the career woman, the woman who rejected traditional femininity. Movies, magazines, newspapers, all of them reinforced the idea that women who strayed from the domestic sphere were unhappy, unfulfilled, destined for tragedy. Elizabeth Short became a perfect symbol for this narrative. She was a young woman who had left home, who had pursued her own dreams, who had rejected traditional domesticity in favor of a career in Hollywood. She was independent, mobile, not tied to a husband or a home, and she had been brutally murdered. The press coverage didn't say it explicitly, but the subtext was clear. This is what happens to women who reject their proper role. This is what happens when you pursue dreams instead of accepting your place. This is what happens when you think you can be independent, can be free. It was a warning, a cautionary tale, and it required that Elizabeth be transformed from a victim into someone who bore responsibility for her own death. So they destroyed her reputation. They made her into a bad girl, a promiscuous woman, a manipulator, and a tease. They made her into someone who deserved it. And in doing so, they killed her again. But perhaps no part of the press's handling of the Black Dahlia case was more cruel than what they did to Phoebe Short, Elizabeth's mother. We've mentioned this before, but it deserves a fuller telling because it illustrates with shocking clarity the depths to which the newspapers were willing to sink in their competition for the story. When the LAPD identified the body as Elizabeth Short, they needed to notify her next of kin. This is a standard, solemn procedure. A police officer, or sometimes a chaplain, goes to the family's home and delivers the news in person. It's one of the hardest duties in law enforcement, telling someone that their loved one is dead. But before the LAPD could make that notification, the Los Angeles Examiner got to Phoebe Short first. It was January 16th, 1947. Phoebe was at home in Medford, Massachusetts, going about her normal routine. She worked as a bookkeeper. She lived modestly with several of her daughters. She worried constantly about Elizabeth, who was far away in California, who wrote infrequently, who seemed to be struggling but always insisted she was fine, that her big break was just around the corner. The phone rang. Phoebe answered. On the other end was a reporter from the Examiner, a man whose name has been lost to history, but whose actions have not. He told Phoebe Short that he was calling from Los Angeles with wonderful news. Her daughter, Elizabeth, had just won a beauty contest. It was a significant achievement, newsworthy, and the Examiner wanted to do a story about it. Could Phoebe answer some questions about Elizabeth? What was she like as a child? What were her dreams, her ambitions? Imagine Phoebe's reaction. Years of worry, of fear that Elizabeth's dreams would lead her to disappointment or worse. And now this validation, success. Her daughter had won something, had achieved something, was being recognized. She was thrilled, relieved, proud. She talked to the reporter for a long time. She told him about Elizabeth's childhood, about her struggles with asthma, about how she'd always been drawn to beauty and glamour, how she'd practiced poses in the mirror, how she'd dreamed of being in the movies. She shared memories, personal details, things a mother remembers about a beloved daughter. The reporter took notes, thanked her, and then, probably consulting with his editor, made a calculation. They had what they needed: the exclusive quotes, the personal details, the color that would make their story richer, more intimate, more saleable than anything their competitors could produce. Now they could tell her the truth. The reporter got back on the phone with Phoebe, and he told her that there had been a mistake, a misunderstanding. Elizabeth hadn't won a beauty contest. Elizabeth was dead, murdered. Her body had been found in Los Angeles, mutilated almost beyond recognition. Try to imagine receiving that news, the emotional whiplash from joy to horror in a single sentence, from pride to grief, from relief to devastation. Phoebe Short collapsed. She became hysterical. Her daughters had to care for her, had to call a doctor, but the examiner wasn't done with her. They called back, offered to fly Phoebe and her daughters to Los Angeles, all expenses paid. They would help with the arrangements, with identifying the body, with whatever the family needed during this terrible time. All they asked in return was that Phoebe speak exclusively to the examiner, that she give them her story, her quotes, her grief, that she not talk to any other newspapers. Phoebe, overwhelmed, in shock, not thinking clearly, agreed. The examiner flew the Short family to Los Angeles. They put them up in a hotel. They were solicitous, kind, helpful, and they milked every moment of Phoebe's grief for content. They photographed her at the morgue, identifying her daughter's body. They photographed her weeping. They interviewed her about her feelings, asking her to describe her pain in vivid detail for their readers. They ran headlines: Mother's grief over Black Dahlia's death. Dahlia's mother. Who could have done this to my baby? They printed her quotes, her memories, the intimate details she had shared, thinking she was celebrating her daughter's success, now repurposed to add color to the story of her daughter's murder. And when Phoebe finally realized what had been done to her, when she understood that she had been manipulated and exploited, that her grief had been commodified, she broke down completely. She gave one final statement to the press, and it was a rebuke. I didn't raise my daughter to be murdered. She was a good girl. Whatever they're saying about her, she was a good girl. But by then, the narrative had been established. The Examiner had its exclusive. The other papers had followed suit with their own coverage. The character of the Black Dahlia, promiscuous, manipulative, doomed, had been created. And Phoebe Short's truth, a mother's truth, was just another quote to be printed and forgotten. The cruelty of what was done to Phoebe Short is almost beyond comprehension. To lie to a mother about her daughter's death, to manipulate her grief for profit, to exploit the most vulnerable moment of her life. It is a violation so profound that it still has the power to shock, even 75 years later. But for the Examiner, it was just good business. They got their exclusive, they sold papers, they won the competition, and a mother was left to grieve, not just for her murdered daughter, but for the way that daughter's memory was being destroyed, sold, transformed into something ugly and false. But the newspapers were just the beginning. They created the myth of the Black Dahlia. Hollywood made it eternal. Film noir was the dominant style of American cinema in the late 1940s and early 50s. Dark, cynical movies about crime and corruption, about beautiful women and dangerous men, about cities that looked like paradise but were really hell. The Black Dahlia case was film noir come to life. It had all the elements: the murdered beauty, the corrupt cops, the seedy underbelly of Los Angeles, the unsolved mystery. It was as if a screenwriter had crafted the whole thing, designed it specifically to appeal to post war anxieties about sex and violence and the darkness lurking beneath the American dream. Hollywood directors and writers noticed. They absorbed the case. And they began, almost immediately, to incorporate its elements into their films. In 1948, just a year after the murder, a film called The Pitfall was released. It starred Dick Powell and Elizabeth Scott, and while it wasn't explicitly about the Black Dahlia, its plot involved a beautiful, mysterious woman who is murdered and a man who becomes entangled in the investigation. The woman in the film is portrayed as both victim and temptress, innocent and corrupt. The echoes of the Black Dahlia coverage are unmistakable. In 1950, Sunset Boulevard premiered. Billy Wilder's masterpiece about a faded silent film star and the young screenwriter who becomes her kept man. The film opens with a corpse floating in a swimming pool, and the dead man's narration guides us through the story. It's a movie about Hollywood's ability to consume and destroy, to turn people into commodities and then discard them. It's not about Elizabeth Short, but it's about what Los Angeles did to Elizabeth Short. It's about the machinery of the dream factory and the human cost of its operations. Throughout the 1950s, film noir continued to feature murdered women, beautiful corpses, mysteries that revealed the corruption of the city. Kiss Me Deadly in 1955. Touch of Evil in 1958, each one drawing on the visual and thematic template that the Black Dahlia case had helped establish. Film historians have written extensively about how the Black Dahlia murder influenced noir cinema. The image of the beautiful dead woman became a recurring motif. The femme fatale who is both alluring and dangerous, who invites violence through her very existence, became a stock character. And in creating these characters and telling these stories over and over, Hollywood reinforced the narrative that the newspapers had created, that beautiful, independent women are dangerous, that they disrupt the social order, that they seduce men and lead them to ruin, and that they often end up dead, their deaths serving as both punishment and entertainment. Elizabeth Short didn't just influence individual films, she influenced an entire genre. She became part of the visual and thematic language of film noir, one of the archetypal figures that the genre returned to again and again. But these films weren't about her. They were inspired by her, by the myth of her, but they had nothing to do with the real woman. They were using her death, using the image of her corpse as a storytelling device, as atmosphere, as a way to signal to audiences that they were entering a world of shadows and danger. She had become a trope, a symbol, a piece of cinematic shorthand, and with each film that used her image, her memory, the real Elizabeth Short disappeared a little more, buried under layers of fiction. For several decades after her death, the Black Dahlia case faded somewhat from public consciousness. It remained unsolved, a cold case in the LAPD files, but it was no longer front page news. Los Angeles moved on. Other scandals, other murders, other stories captured the city's attention. But the case never entirely disappeared. And in the 1980s and 90s, it roared back into the cultural spotlight, resurrected by writers who saw in it an opportunity to explore larger themes about Los Angeles, about crime, about the American psyche. In 1977, John Gregory Dunn published True Confessions, a novel loosely based on the Black Dahlia case. The book transplanted the murder into a story about two brothers, one a priest, one a detective, and used it as a lens to examine corruption in the Catholic Church and the LAPD, the moral compromises of institutional power. Dunn's novel was critically acclaimed. It was adapted into a film in 1981, starring Robert De Niro and Robert Duvall. The movie was successful, introducing a new generation to the Black Dahlia story, though filtered through Dunn's fictional reimagining. But the writer who truly resurrected the case, who made it central to American crime fiction, was James Elroy. Elroy published The Black Dahlia in 1987, the first book in his L.A. Quartet series. It's a sprawling, brutal, obsessive novel that uses the murder of Elizabeth Short as the inciting incident for a story about two LAPD detectives who become consumed by the case, their investigation leading them into the darkest corners of Los Angeles and their own psyches. The book is extraordinary. Elroy's prose is like a punch to the face, staccato and violent and utterly compelling. His Los Angeles is a nightmare city, every institution corrupt, every person compromised, a place where evil isn't the exception, but the rule. And his fictionalized version of Elizabeth Short, rendered as Betty Short in the novel, is one of the most fully realized portraits in all of crime fiction. Elroy gives her an interior life, gives her agency and complexity, treats her as a person rather than just a victim or a symbol. But here's the complicated truth: Elroy's The Black Dahlia is still fiction. It's inspired by the real case. It uses real names and real locations, but it invents a solution to the murder, creates motivations and conspiracies that may have no basis in reality. It's a brilliant novel, but it's a novel nonetheless. And for many readers, Elroy's version became the version. His fictional solution to the murder became, in the popular imagination, a plausible theory about the real crime. The line between fact and fiction blurred, and the real Elizabeth Short became even harder to see. Elroy's personal connection to the case is worth exploring. In 1958, when Elroy was 10 years old, his mother, Geneva Hilliker Elroy, was murdered in Los Angeles. She was strangled and her body was dumped on a roadside. The case was never solved. Elroy grew up haunted by his mother's unsolved murder. He became obsessed with crime, with Los Angeles, with the darkness that could swallow women and leave no answers behind. The Black Dahlia case became, for him, a kind of parallel to his own trauma. Another unsolved murder, another woman whose killer escaped justice. In interviews, Elroy has been remarkably open about this connection. He said that writing The Black Dahlia was a way of processing his grief over his mother, of trying to make sense of the senseless. He's described Elizabeth Short and his mother as linked in his mind, two women destroyed by the same city, the same masculine violence, the same culture that saw women as disposable. In 1996, Elroy published My Dark Places, a memoir about his mother's murder and his attempt, decades later, to reinvestigate the case. It's a searing, painful book, and in it, he grapples explicitly with his obsession with Elizabeth Short, with the ways he's used her story to try to understand his own. I turned Betty Short into my mother, he wrote. I gave her the ending I wanted for my mother's story. I solved her murder in fiction because I couldn't solve my mother's. In fact, I used her. I exploited her. I did what everyone else had done, turned her into a symbol, a ghost, a projection of my own needs. It's an extraordinary admission, and it raises uncomfortable questions about the ethics of true crime storytelling, about our cultural obsession with murdered women, about the ways we use victims to work through our own traumas and anxieties. Elroy's work is powerful, important, some of the best crime fiction ever written, but it's still a commodification of Elizabeth Short. It's still using her death to sell books, to entertain readers, to make meaning out of her suffering. And Elroy knows this. He's tormented by it, but he also can't stop. His entire career is built on the foundation of unsolved murders, of women who were killed and forgotten, of his own attempt to remember them, and in remembering, to perhaps give them some measure of dignity and justice. It's complicated. All of it is so deeply, painfully complicated. In 2006, Brian De Palma directed a film adaptation of Elroy's The Black Dahlia, starring Josh Hartnett, Scarlett Johansson, and Hilary Swank. The film was a critical and commercial disappointment, criticized for being overly convoluted, for losing the raw power of Elroy's prose in translation to the screen. But its failure didn't matter, because by then, the Black Dahlia had become a permanent fixture in American popular culture. The case was referenced in television shows, in other novels, in true crime documentaries. Elizabeth Short's image, particularly the famous photograph of her with the flower in her hair, became iconic, recognizable, a piece of visual shorthand for mystery and noir and the dark side of Hollywood. In the 21st century, the case has been examined in countless documentaries, podcasts, YouTube videos, and books. Each new generation discovers it, becomes fascinated by it, tries to solve it. There's a Black Dahlia walking tour in Los Angeles where tourists can visit the sites associated with the case. The Biltmore Hotel, the vacant lot on Norton Avenue, now a residential neighborhood, the locations where she stayed in her final months. There's a Black Dahlia cocktail at some bars, a Black Dahlia Halloween costume, Black Dahlia merchandise. She has become a brand, a product, a piece of dark Americana that can be packaged and sold in infinite variations. And with each retelling, with each new book or movie or documentary, the real Elizabeth Short becomes a little less visible. The myth grows thicker, more elaborate, more distant from the truth. We tell ourselves that we're remembering her, honoring her, seeking justice for her. But are we? Or are we just consuming her, using her story for entertainment, for the thrill of the mystery, for the dark pleasure of engaging with a tale of beauty and horror? These are uncomfortable questions, and they apply not just to the Black Dahlia case, but to the entire true crime genre. What does it mean to turn real suffering into entertainment? What do we owe to the victims whose stories we tell? Is it possible to engage with these cases ethically, with respect and compassion, or is the very act of consuming them as entertainment a form of exploitation? I don't have answers, but I think the questions are important, and I think Elizabeth Short deserves for us to at least ask them. There's a photograph that's been hanging in the background of this entire series. Not literally, of course, this is audio, words in the darkness, but metaphorically. It's been there since the very beginning, in the opening of part one, and it's been there in spirit ever since. It's the photograph of Elizabeth Short smiling, a flower in her dark hair, the image that showed her as she was, a young woman, hopeful, alive. And I want you to imagine that photograph now as we reach the end of this episode. But I want you to imagine it not alone, but surrounded. Imagine a wall covered with other images, layer upon layer of them, so thick that the original photograph is almost completely obscured. Movie posters for The Black Dahlia, for True Confessions, for all the noir films she inspired, book covers, true crime paperbacks with lurid titles and sensationalized covers, crime scene photos, tabloid headlines, The Black Dahlia, Hollywood's most mysterious murder, the unsolved case that haunts Los Angeles. Who killed the Black Dahlia? On and on, dozens of them, hundreds, covering the wall, each one using her name, her face, her story to sell something, to entertain, to profit. And behind all of them, buried beneath the weight of all that exploitation, is that one simple photograph. Elizabeth, smiling, a flower in her hair. They sold her murder. They sold her name. They sold a ghost they had created. The newspapers sold her in 1947, turning her tragedy into headlines and circulation numbers. Hollywood sold her, using her death as inspiration for an entire genre of films about beautiful corpses and dark cities. Writers sold her, building careers on the foundation of her unsolved murder. Documentarians and podcasters and tour guides sell her still, offering audiences the thrill of the mystery, the pleasure of the puzzle. Even I am selling her in a sense by telling her story, by asking you to listen, by building a narrative around her life and death. I am part of this same system, this same machinery that has been consuming Elizabeth Short for 75 years. I'd like to think I'm doing it differently, that this series is an attempt to push past the myth, to see the real person, to honor her humanity rather than exploit her tragedy. But I'm using her name to get your attention, aren't I? I'm using the mystery to create suspense. I'm trading on the cultural weight of the Black Dahlia story. So I'm complicit too. We all are. Everyone who engages with this case, everyone who tells the story or listens to it. And with every book, every movie, every documentary, every podcast, every salacious headline, the real Elizabeth Short, the girl who loved to laugh, the girl with the gardenia in her hair, the girl who dreamed of something better and died without ever achieving it, disappeared a little more. She's been buried, not just by her killer who put her body in the ground on Norton Avenue, but by all of us, by the culture that turned her into a commodity, by the endless mythologizing that has replaced her truth with 1,000 different fictions. Phoebe Short lived until 1975. She was 78 years old when she died, having outlived her daughter by 28 years. Those were 28 years during which she had to watch her daughter's name become a punchline, a Halloween costume, a trivia question. 28 years of seeing Elizabeth reduced to the Black Dahlia, watching the girl she raised be transformed into a symbol she didn't recognize. She gave very few interviews after those initial traumatic days in 1947. She retreated into privacy, into silence, protecting what remained of her memories from the machinery that wanted to consume them. But occasionally, when approached by a researcher or a journalist who seemed genuinely interested in the truth, she would speak. And she always said the same thing: my daughter was a good girl. She wasn't what they said she was. She was kind. She was loving. She just wanted to be happy. That's the truth Phoebe Short carried. The mother's truth. The truth that knew Elizabeth not as a myth, but as a person. And it's the truth we need to remember as we move toward the final episode of this series. Because in the end, the Black Dahlia case is not really about a mystery. It's not about suspects or theories or the thrill of trying to solve an unsolvable crime. It's about a person, a real person named Elizabeth Short, who lived and struggled and dreamed and died. And she deserves better than what we've given her, better than to be endlessly recycled as entertainment, as a ghost story, as a brand. She deserves to be remembered as what she was: human, flawed, yes, troubled, certainly, but human, real, worthy of dignity and compassion and grief. Not a symbol, not a mystery, not the Black Dahlia, just Elizabeth, the girl with the gardenia in her hair. As the final shadows fall on this story, if you found yourself drifting away or simply appreciate a quiet mystery, consider subscribing to Midnight Narrative. Gently tap that like button to help more quiet seekers find us. And for more stories to help you unwind, explore our other videos right here. Don't forget to ring the notification bell if you wish to be softly alerted when a new narrative begins. Until next time, may your sleep be deep and your mysteries shallow.